Chapter 580. Xiao Huan came in with tea with a blushing face. After glancing at Li Yi, she quickly left. The little maid was a little off today. He didn't know what she was thinking about. 16 years old should be the rebellious period. To be safe, he had to ask her later. Li Yi thought so. He turned to look at Li Xian and said, "Tell me, what big business is it? Have you heard of the Wang family of Luochuan?" Li Xian looked at him and asked. Li Yi thought carefully and then shook his head. "I haven't heard of the Wang family of Luochuan, but I've heard of the apples of Luochuan." In his impression, Luochuan was the hometown of apples. The apples of Luochuan were beautiful in shape, bright in color, crispy in texture, and delicious in color and aroma. Of course, this Luochuan was not the same Luochuan. He just didn't know what the Wang family of Luochuan was. Did they start by selling apples? Li Xian rubbed the space between his eyebrows and said, "The Wang family of Luochuan is the family of the princess." "Is it that Wang family?" Li Yi looked at him and asked. "Yes, it's that Wang family," Li Xian nodded and said. Li Yi naturally knew about the Wang family that the heir's consort belonged to. However, no one had ever mentioned the Wang family and apple to him. What did it have to do with Luochuan? Generally speaking, if a family had the title of a certain county in front of it, it was really impressive. Just like the Cui family, they had extremely high prestige among the people and scholars. Their strength was not obvious, and there were no soldiers in the family, but they had great influence. In their own land, they were like local tyrants. With a little instigation, the old Li family's world would be in chaos, and even the royal family had to give them face. Naturally, Li Yi had heard of this Wang family. It was originally a family similar to the 5 surnames and 7 glances of the Sui and Tang dynasties. Although it was not completely destroyed in the course of history, after more than 100 years of changes in the situation, its current strength was much weaker than those aristocratic families in his previous life. However, it should not be underestimated. The Wang family was a relatively different existence among these families. There was only one reason: they were rich. Although opportunistic merchants were looked down upon by the upper class, they would be fools if they didn't earn money when there was money in front of them. Even noble families had to make a living, right? Besides, filling their stomachs wasn't the only thing they pursued. On the surface, they looked down on merchants, but they had plenty of ways to earn money in the dark. But among these major clans, only the Wang family was able to do business openly and to such an extent. No one knew how much money the Wang family had. They only knew that the Wang family had shops in almost all the states and counties of the Jing kingdom. They owned the largest chamber of commerce in the Jing kingdom. They were the kind of people who could kill a lot of self-proclaimed rich merchants with just a few taels of silver. Even though the Li family was not short of money now, it was still far from being comparable to such a giant. If you have money, you have to keep a low profile. This law was not suitable for future generations, but it was applicable here. This one, no, a big fat sheep, would attract attention wherever it went. The country needed money to run, and so did revolts. With the Wang family's money, there would be an economic foundation, and then it would be easier to carry out the construction of the upper class. Of course, no matter if one wanted to rebel or to rule the country, one could not rob openly. That would not win the hearts of the people. Moreover, the Wang family was not a pushover. In addition, the Wang family had always cozied up to the royal family. When the country was in trouble, they would be the first to take the lead in donating money, actively exert their family's influence, and help implement the various new decrees of the imperial court within their sphere of influence. They were simply the role model of aristocratic families and the firmest ally of the old emperor. This was also the main reason why the king of Shu always wanted to get on the good side of the Wang family. The marriage between the big families was not a matter of the younger generation and the younger generation liking each other. They had to consider more political factors. The marriage meant taking sides. If the king of Shu married the daughter of the Wang family, it meant that the Wang family was already standing behind the king of Shu. With the Cui family and the Wang family as the leaders, the position of the Eastern Palace could not be more stable. Speaking of which, the king of Shu had the backing of the royal family and the Chui family. A marriage alliance with the Wang family could be said to be a well-matched match. Unfortunately, the peach that he had been picking for a long time had been snatched away by someone. The king of Shu's dream of winning over the Wang family was shattered, and from then on, he regarded Li Xian as a thorn in his side. Li Yi glanced at Li Xian. Until now, he still could not figure out what the Wang family saw in this guy. The Wang family was, after all, an aristocratic family. Logically speaking, their vision should not be bad. However, it had to be said that the father of the crown princess was really not good at picking a son-in-law. Your father-in-law asked you to come? Li Yi looked at him and asked. A trace of awkwardness appeared on Li Xian's face. He said, the liquor, soap, and perfume business has taken over the capital in the past year. However, we do not have the manpower and financial resources to expand to other areas. This time, the Wang family wants to seek cooperation. 2 days ago, my father-in-law personally came to the crown prince's residence. The awkwardness on Li Xian's face deepened. At certain times, he was still a little thin-skinned, especially when he had something to ask of someone. It was difficult for him to speak up. Li Yi roughly understood what he meant. It was nothing more than the Wang family also taking a fancy to this big piece of cake and wanted a piece of it. The profits were huge. Although the Wang family now had countless shops in various industries, the majority of the profits were still in these few businesses. With such a big business, how could the Wang family not have this kind of vision? It was not surprising that they had taken a fancy to these few businesses. Of course, for both parties, this was indeed a win-win situation. Because of the lack of manpower, material, and financial resources, the business that Li Yi, Li Xian, and Her Royal Highness could only occupy the capital's market at most. And although the Wang family was capable, they lacked the core technology. This was the most crucial point. Without Li Yi's consent, they could not intervene at all. Cooperating with the Wang family would expand the market. In the future, money would definitely flow to the Wang family. Mississippi Lu was not afraid of squandering. Not to mention spending 1,000 taels in 3 days, even if she spent 10,000 taels in 3 days, spending 10,000 taels in 3 days would make her butt swollen. In the future, there would be many things to spend money on. This way, they could also take out money to do more things. In addition, they had also established a beneficial relationship with the Wang family. Between families, this relationship was stronger than the relationship brought about by marriage. Of course, if the crown prince's wife had any good-looking sisters, then the two families would have an additional layer of bond on top of the benefits. Naturally, this was not considered. This matter did not bring any harm to the Wang family. Moreover, since Li Xian had spoken, as long as it did not cross the bottom line, he would not reject it. After all, in the entire Jing kingdom, there was only one person who would step forward and give him a kick instead of stopping him when he was beating up the king of Shu. Li Yi nodded and said, if you have time in the next 2 days, ask the Wang family to send someone over to discuss the details of the cooperation. Li Xian thought for a while and said, you don't have to take me into consideration for the Wang family's matters. Just do what you have to do. He weighed in his heart for a long time and finally made a decision. Okay, then tell them not to send anyone over, Li Yi said straightforwardly. Forget I said anything. Li Xian stood up. The guilt in his heart disappeared without a trace. He lifted his feet and walked out. I will bring someone from the Wang family over tomorrow. Wait a minute. Li Yi stopped him in time. Li Xian stepped out of the door with one foot and the other foot was ready to step out at any time. Did the Wang family of Luochuan sell apples in the past? Li Yi looked at him and asked curiously. Chapter 581. The Wang family had never sold apples, which made Li Yi feel a little disappointed. When he realized that Li Xian had never mentioned the Academy of Sciences from beginning to end, this disappointment expanded a little. What a silly and naive child he used to be. Now he actually knew so many twists and turns. It was clearly a matter of asking for help, but in the end, it turned out that he owed him. Li Yi felt that his IQ had dropped a little recently, and he needed to eat more walnuts to make up for it. The little maid always used the door to pick up walnuts. It was a curse to say that the head was caught by the door. Li Yi had some doubts whether the walnuts caught by the door could still make up for the brain. Would the more he ate, the more stupid he became? Young master, it's done. Xiao Huan ran over from the door and put the handkerchief on the table in front of Li Yi. On the handkerchief was a pile of walnuts she had just peeled. Li Yi fed her one first, then looked at her and asked, Xiao Huan, have you been hiding something from the young master recently? No. The little maid looked up at him and said, Xiao Huan has nothing to hide from the young master. Li Yi asked again, then tell me, what did the young lady say to you yesterday? The little maid was stunned for a moment, then her little face turned red. She lowered her head and rubbed the corner of her clothes. She whispered, no, nothing, lowering her head, blushing, rubbing the corner of her clothes. Then there was really something. Li Yi sighed. When a girl grew up, she could not be kept at home. The little maid had grown up and actually knew what was hidden from him. He waved his hand and said, it's getting late. Go back to your room and rest early. Yes. The little maid lowered her head and answered. Her voice was like a mosquito. Rui was not here, so he had to sleep alone at night. Li Yi simply washed up, lay on the bed, closed his eyes, and sorted out what had happened recently in his mind. In Wulin, everything was gradually on the right track. The brothel was as usual, and everything was in good order. New underwear began to go out of the brothel. Although it had not been fully accepted, the current sales volume could be regarded as hot. The deterioration of the old emperor's health was somewhat out of his expectations. This caused some of his arrangements and preparations to appear a little rushed. When the time came, there might be a huge deviation from what he had expected, and he would need to prepare a new path of retreat. However, this matter was not that urgent at the moment. If it really came to that, he would not need too much time to prepare. Putting all these aside, he really didn't want the old emperor to pass away too early. The relationship between ruler and subject was rarely reflected between the two of them. What was more important in his heart was that next-door uncle who could comment on a few dishes and a bowl of white fungus and lotus seed soup with him in the garden of Ning Wangfu. Live well, Li Yi sighed as he heard a faint creaking sound. Didn't you say you would be fasting for 3 days? Why are you back today? The door opened and closed, and a graceful figure walked in from the darkness. There was no light in the room, so he couldn't see clearly. Li Yi asked with some doubt. The footsteps were getting louder, and the figure walked to the bedside. There was no response, and there was a rustling sound in his ear. It seemed that she was taking off her clothes. The next moment, Li Yi felt the quilt was lifted, and a small figure crawled in. Rui was nearly 1.7 meters tall, the standard height of a goddess with long legs. Sleeping next to him would definitely not feel like this. The familiar fragrance lingering at the tip of his nose made an extremely surprised expression appear on Li Yi's face. Xiao Huan? He asked with some disbelief. Young master. The little servant girl's body curled up, and her voice was a little shaky. Li Yi felt that her body seemed to be burning. Why did you come here? Go back to sleep. Li Yi sat up from the bed and said, if you are afraid to be alone, then go sleep with Second Mississippi, young master. Young master doesn't like Xiao Huan? Li Yi felt that the little servant girl's body under the quilt was no longer trembling, but there was a sobbing tone in her voice. No, Li Yi didn't know how to answer for a moment. At this time, in the darkness, the little servant girl had already sat up from the bed. She sat on the edge of the bed, bent over, and seemed to be looking for her shoes. Xiao Huan, leave immediately. She spoke in a low voice, but there was a faint, almost inaudible sobbing sound. What are you doing? Come here. Li Yi was stunned for a moment, and then pulled her over, slapped her but hard, and covered her with the quilt. The little servant girl's body wriggled a few times, and Li Yi reached out to pull her face. Don't move. So she really didn't move. Did eldest miss teach you? In the darkness, Li Yi touched her forehead and asked. No, no, it was Xiao Huan herself. She stopped sobbing, and rubbed her butt. Her voice was as soft as a mosquito. Young master, Xiao Huan is already 16 years old. Li Yi rubbed her head and said, 16 years old, still too young. The little servant girl stuck out her chest under the quilt, and said in a small voice, not young anymore. There was only one quilt, and the two of them were squeezed face to face. The distance that Li Yi deliberately kept disappeared after she stuck out her chest. Don't move. Li Yi's body stiffened, and he said in a low voice. Oh. The little servant girl said in a low voice. After a while, she suddenly said, young master, what is it? There seems to be something under the quilt. Don't move. Li Yi's body stiffened, and he said. There really is something. The little servant girl said seriously. In the next moment, Li Yi gritted his teeth, and moved her hand away. I said, don't move. When he was washing up in the morning, Li Yi looked at his reflection in the water, and he stared at the two dark circles under his eyes in a daze. Last night, he tossed and turned with Xiao Huan until midnight, and he didn't sleep well. Anyone who told a fairy tale until 2 or 3 o'clock would be like this, and he didn't even know when she fell asleep. He could only look but not move, and he had to tell her stories to coax her to sleep. Last night was really a double torture for his body and soul. This debt, when Rui came back, he would settle it with her. Young master, you're awake. Xiao Huan walked in from outside, and her face was red. No matter how Li Yi looked at it, he felt that something was wrong. After staring at her for a while, he realized that today, she didn't do her hair in the two buns that he was most familiar with. Instead, she pulled her hair up, and combed it into a bride's hairstyle. Heavens, does she even know what this means? Li Yi rubbed the space between his eyebrows, and his mind became more and more confused. Xiao Huan's face was a little hot from his stare, and she quickly ran out. A group of servant girls in the residence immediately surrounded her. When Mississippi Lu passed by the door, she looked at him a few more times, and Li Yi felt that she was laughing at him. When Li Xian walked to the door, he turned back to look at the courtyard. When he turned back again, he asked in astonishment, even her hair is combed up, it can't be, you really ate your little servant girl? Chapter 582. Wang Yong greets Mr. Li. A voice came from behind Li Xian. Li Yi saw a strange young man standing behind him. Who is this? When Li Yi asked, he already had a guess in his heart. He should be the person sent by the Wang family to discuss the cooperation. In any case, the Wang family was one of the top aristocratic families in the Jing country. As the head of the family, it was naturally impossible for him to be present. The person in front of him was most likely one of Li Xian's brother-in-law. Li Xian introduced, this is Qin, Er's elder brother. Li Yi's heart slightly moved. The elder brother of the princess was the eldest son of the Wang family and the future head of the family. The Wang family sent Wang Yong here. This time, the Wang family was very sincere. As Li Yi looked at Wang Yong, the young man in front of him was also looking at him. There were few people in the whole Jing kingdom who could make the Wang family take the initiative to cooperate with them. It was always others who begged them. However, this time, his father asked him to come in person, which was a very high standard of courtesy. He had heard about all kinds of things about Mr. Li before. He fought with the envoy of the Qi kingdom, beat up the prince of his own country, made a lot of fops in the capital, and made the king of Shu jump into the lake with his murderous eyes. In short, the things that happened to Mr. Li could be said to be extremely legendary. Today, the first feeling he had was surprise. He was surprised that the person who caused such a storm in the capital was so young. At such a young age, he had already obtained something that countless people, including the emperor, could not obtain in their whole lives. He was the only one in the young generation. Brother Wang, please. Li Yi stretched out his hand to the room and said with a smile. The Wang family's attitude was enough to send the eldest son of the wife here. Of course, the Li family couldn't neglect it. In the hall, the two people sat down. Li Xian looked around and asked, where should I sit? Go make a pot of tea and bring it here. Li Yi didn't want to ask Xiao Huan to come here. Li Xian never regarded himself as an outsider here. Today, he would let him thoroughly feel the feeling of being the host. Thank you for your hospitality today, Mr. Li. Wang Yong will take his leave. An hour later, the eldest son of the Wang clan stood at the entrance of the Li residence and clasped his hands. Brother Wang, take care. Li Yi cupped his hands in greeting. Seeing that he and Li Xian had boarded the carriage, he turned around and left. He was only discussing business matters with the other party. After the conversation began, he went straight to the point. It didn't take long for them to reach an agreement on many issues. Of course, the reason why they were able to come to an agreement so quickly was because the Wang family was indeed very sincere. They agreed to many of the conditions that he had set out without the slightest hesitation. It must be known that Li Yi had long been prepared for them to haggle, and some of the conditions were indeed harsh. However, he did not expect that Wang Yong would agree to all of the conditions. In the past hour, he had wondered several times whether the Wang clan had come to deliver the money. In general, this conversation was carried out in a friendly and harmonious atmosphere, even to the point of being overly friendly. There was no free lunch in the world, which made Li Yi a little vigilant. However, based on the current situation, everyone could earn money, and there was no harm to the Li family. As for what would happen in the future, he would wait and see. Clans like the Chui family and the Wang clan, although they were rich and powerful, in his eyes, they were not that terrible. After all, the foundation of these clans was largely based on their reputation among the common people or scholars. As for how to ruin their reputation, he actually did not know at all. The few maids in the residence surrounded Xiao Huan and chattered about something. Li Yi walked over, coughed lightly and immediately dispersed. Each of them went to do their own things. Son-in-law. Xiao Huan blushed. No matter how Li Yi looked at her tied-up hair, he found it strange. He pinched her face and said, "Come in." In the room, beside the bronze mirror, the young maid asked with a bitter face, "Son-in-law, does second Mrs. hair not look good when she combs it?" Li Yi finally understood why her hair looked so strange today. He spread her hair and said, "Your second miss looks good when she holds a sword and slashes people." Combing her hair, hee. Son-in-law, let me do it. The young maid wanted to stand up from the chair but was pressed down by Li Yi. Don't move. Hearing the words, "Don't move," as if she thought of something, the young maid's face immediately blushed. As Li Yi combed her hair, he said, "Don't learn from your second Mississippi. A girl who doesn't know how to cook, doesn't know how to do needlework, doesn't even comb her hair well, and likes to squander." Glancing at the bronze mirror, there was a clear flash of cold light in the direction of the door. Li Yi said without batting an eyelid, "Girls should squander. Silver is to be spent. Girls should not hang around the stove all day. They should be independent and self-reliant. You have to learn from second miss on this point." The sword in the bronze mirror disappeared. Li Yi heaved a sigh of relief. The young maid asked doubtfully, "But didn't son-in-law just say that you don't want Xiao Huan to learn from second miss?" "Don't move." Li Yi pressed down on her head. "If you move, it will be messed up." After a while, looking at the young maid who had 2 new buns of hair, Li Yi adjusted the position of the 2 buns and nodded. She finally looked more pleasing to the eye. Xiao Huan wrinkled her nose and asked, "Son-in-law, does it really not look good when your hair is tied up?" "It doesn't look good." Li Yi nodded and said straightforwardly. "Hee, then Xiao Huan will comb it like this in the future." When she skipped out, her eyes curved into crescent moons. This was the first time son-in-law personally combed her hair. She ran out of the door and saw a figure walking in from outside. She immediately jogged over. "Miss, you are back. How was the vegetarian offering this time?" Ru Yi sat in front of the dressing table. She took off the pearl hairpin and replaced it with an ordinary hairpin. Li Yi walked over and asked. "Everything went smoothly," Ru Yi said with a smile. "Those things were done by the servants. I only watched from the side." She thought of something and said, "Master Tan Yin of the Cold Mountain Temple asked me to send his regards to you. He said that if you have time, he would like to discuss Buddhism with you." There was no time to discuss with a monk who suffered from being duped about how to dupe others. This was a secret that would not be passed on easily without a few thousand taels of silver. Xiao Huan, it was my wife who asked her to do this. Li Yi looked at her and asked. Such a silly little servant girl with a childlike temperament would definitely not have the guts, and would not have the mood to do what she did last night. Although she denied it many times when he asked her, but the only person she would protect like this was Rui. Rui said in a small voice, Xiao Huan is already 16. She was originally a Tong Fong, and she also likes you. 16 is still too young. Li Yi sighed and said, at least wait until 20. Rui raised her head to look at him and said, but hubby, I have not passed the age of peach and plum. Li Yi thought for a while and said, then 19, it cannot be any earlier. Rui lowered her head, I was thinking, if Xiao Huan can give birth to a child for hubby, for the Li family. Li Yi's body stiffened slightly. In order to ensure that the eldest son was the legitimate son, no matter if it was a servant girl or a concubine, they were not allowed to have children earlier than the legitimate wife. If such a thing happened in those aristocratic families, it might even involve lives. Now, she actually did not even care about this. One could imagine, before she made this decision, how much hesitation and struggle in her heart, hubby. She raised her head to look at Li Yi, her voice was already choked with sobs. I'm sorry, a grandmaster, at this moment, was only an ordinary woman. The 2 tear stains on her extremely beautiful face were rather eye-catching. What's so good about a naughty child, so annoying? Li Yi's face darkened. He turned back and closed the door, carried her up and walked to the bedside. Hubby, don't talk, doesn't my wife like naughty children, let's give birth now. Strange, what are son-in-law and miss doing inside? Why did they close the door again? The little servant girl stood at the door for a while, scratched her head and muttered in confusion. Chapter 583. A little lower, a little more to the side. Yes, there it is. Li Yi was lying on the bed, reading a booklet in his hand. Xiao Huan was sitting on the edge of the bed, gently kneading his waist with her hands. She tested her strength, looked down at Li Yi and asked, young master, is this okay? Well, this strength is fine. Li Yi nodded and flipped through the booklet from the beginning to the end. When he saw Li Xian coming in from outside, he threw the booklet to him. He changed to a more comfortable position and continued to lie on the bed. He yawned and said lazily, well, look at it yourself. You are the director of the Academy of Sciences, not me. How old are you? When can you be more independent? Li Xian casually flipped through it a few times before putting it away with a satisfied expression. He asked, do you have any urgent matters to attend to in the next 2 days? Yes. It had only been a few days since the new year. He had wanted to stay at home with Rui and be affectionate with her. 2 days ago, Madame Dowager had rushed him to visit some elders. He only had some free time today. Hearing Li Xian's tone, he knew he was here to make trouble for him. Thinking about it carefully, he must have something to do if he came. He was simply his jinx. Li Xian automatically ignored Li Yi's answer and said, New Year's just passed, so I want to go visit some of the old generals. You should be going as well, so why don't we go together tomorrow? He naturally had to visit some old generals. On the day of the Imperial Court Conference, old General Shui lent him his personal pillar for him to take a nap. At that time, he had mentioned that it was fine if he didn't pay his respects at the New Year. If he didn't pay his respects at the New Year, he would personally come to block the door. He came to block the door, but it didn't matter on his side. He usually didn't go out and was a full-time husband at home. If he blocked Miss Lu's way and got his leg broken, he would have to pay a large sum of money. If you want to go, you can go first. I will rest for 2 days. Li Yi didn't want to move these 2 days, so he waved his hand and said. Li Xian glanced at him and said, don't blame me for not warning you. If you go alone, something might happen. Isn't it just paying a visit to an elder? What could possibly happen? Li Yi glanced at him, his tone rather disdainful. So this is the Shui manner? Li Yi stood in front of the entrance of a manor and looked at Li Xian as he asked with uncertainty. Li Xian nodded and said, "This is the place." "Is this Grandpa Shue's home?" The tsundere Lolita was also surprised. Originally, she came with Li Xian, but when she went out, she happened to meet the tsundere Lolita and Yong Ning. The tsundere Lolita's rabbit had given birth to a nest of rabbits. Yong Ning was playing with the rabbits at home, and the tsundere Lolita insisted on following her out. This was obviously something that couldn't be rejected. The Shui manor wasn't as grand as Li Yi imagined. There was only an old servant missing an arm at the entrance. He should be the gatekeeper or something like that. The servants of the Crown Prince's manor ran over to hand over the visiting card. After a while, an old man who looked like a housekeeper hurried out from inside. Master was still talking about why the Crown Prince and County Uncle Li haven't come yet. It's time to teach them etiquette. Hearing the old housekeeper's words, Li Yi and Li Xian stopped at the same time. Li Yi turned to look at him and blinked his eyes, meaning to say, "Is it too late to retreat now?" Li Xian blinked and shook his head slightly, meaning, at #yen%. At #yen%. At #yen%. Communication failed, so they could only bite the bullet and continue walking forward. Old General Shue's mansion was excessively simple. There weren't many servants in the mansion, and the few that he met were all rather old. If they weren't missing an arm or a leg, the butler in front of him was the only complete person he had met. The Shui family's servants not only had some kind of physical defect, but they also emitted a dangerous aura. Even the usually bold tsundere Lolita was a little scared and grabbed his sleeves tightly. The old housekeeper brought them to a place and said, "Master and the other generals are inside. Crown Prince and County Uncle Li, you can go in by yourselves." "And the other generals?" Li Yi and Li Xian looked at each other and pulled the tsundere Lolita's hand to walk outside. They should have checked the almanac before coming out today. It must have been written, "Stay at home, don't visit old General Shui." "Brat, you are already here, and you want to leave just like that? What do you think the Shui residence is?" A cold snort came from inside, and both of them smiled bitterly at the same time. They walked into the house helplessly, and a strong smell of alcohol assaulted their nostrils. When they raised their heads, they saw a few stern faces. They could only bow helplessly. "Greetings, old General Shui, General Ma." After greeting the five of them, old General Shui snorted and said, "Old General Shui, General Ma. Do I look older than this old man?" There was no way to answer this question, and there was no need to. According to Li Yi's experience, they would start fighting amongst themselves next. Sure enough, General Ma glanced at old General Shui and said, "Pfft, you always take advantage of your seniority, so of course you are old." There were melon seeds on the table, and Li Yi was munching on them while chatting with the three old generals. The two old men in the hall, whose combined age was 100 years old, were arguing until their necks were red, and they started a deep discussion on who was older. One of the old generals looked at the tsundere Lolita sitting beside Li Yi, and a hint of doubt appeared on his old face. He asked, "This young lady looks familiar, could it be?" He thought for a while, and finally realized something. He immediately stood up and said, "Greetings, Princess Shaoning." Even though the tsundere Lolita was only a Lolita, she was still a Princess Lolita. Xiao Huan was immature and played with them all day long, but these old generals in the imperial court would not forget their etiquette just because of her young age. Old General Shui and old General Ma stopped arguing and walked over with big steps. After taking a closer look, they realized that the young lady who was standing beside Li Yi just now and was ignored by them was actually Princess Shaoning, and they immediately greeted her. The tsundere Lolita acted like a little adult, and waved her hand and said, "Grandpa Shui and the other grandpas don't have to be so courteous. This was a private occasion, and there was no need to be so formal." Old General Shui had also watched her grow up, so he naturally would not be restrained at this moment. After arranging for the little princess to sit at the top, he then glanced at Li Yi and Li Xian, and asked, "Is this how you two juniors come to visit your elders?" "Servants, bring in the gifts." Li Xian clearly knew the rules. In previous years, when he came to the capital during the new year, he often used this method. He clapped his hands, and immediately, a few servants carried the gifts in. Naturally, Li Yi had also prepared beforehand. What gifts to prepare, and how generous the gifts should be, were all discussed between him and Li Xian. Old General Ma glanced at them and said, "You only want to visit old Shui?" Li Xian's expression changed instantly. He did not expect everyone to gather at old General Shui's house today. His eyeballs rolled, and he immediately smiled and said, "Of course not. How can I miss the few elders? Today, I wanted to visit each and every one of you." Pointing at the gifts carried in by his family servants, he said, "These are old General Shui's, and these are old General Ma's." When he stretched out his hand again, he realized that he had only prepared 4 big boxes. After glancing at Li Yi, he pointed at a big box carried in by the Li family servants and said, "These are old General Song's. I'm a step too late." Li Yi looked at him in a daze, and he started to try his best to recall when Li Xian's conscience started to be gnawed away by dogs. Chapter 584. This old man doesn't need to ask for too much. Tomorrow, I'll send the exact same thing to the Ma residence as it was for old Shui. Old General Ma pointed to one of the boxes and said, "This is my box. Carry it out for me first. I will take it away later." Old General Shui shouted angrily, "Pfft! You shameless old man! How dare you scam the things that 2 juniors gave me? Bullsh *t. Are your ears for catching wind? Didn't you hear that you said it was for me, old man? Say it again. Why? Do you want to fight?" Li Yi was a little disappointed. These 2 old generals didn't have the air of a general at all. They had killed their way out of a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood. If they could fight, they should try not to talk nonsense. Instead, they should grab their weapons and fight. They were like 2 shrews who had their hands on their waists and were cursing at the god of war. Old General Song looked much more refined than the other 2. He looked at Li Yi and asked with a smile, "How is old madam's health?" Li Yi nodded and said, "Thank you for your concern, old General Song. Old madam's health has always been good." After all, the Li family had been glorious for many years. Even though they had declined in recent years, they still had an assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel to support them. Many of their connections in the capital had not faded yet. Li Yi had never been interested in these things. However, after visiting the Li family one by one at the request of old madam, he realized that the Li family was not as easy to bully as they appeared to be. No wonder they could stand firm in the capital despite being suppressed by the Qin family. "Your Highness, County Uncle Li, please have some tea." The old butler brought the tea over and said with a kind face, "Why are you drinking tea in my house?" Old General Shui strode over and opened the bottle of wine. He said, "Drink this." A strong smell of alcohol hit them. The proud Lolita wrinkled her nose and hid behind Li Yi. Li Yi and Li Xian's expressions changed at the same time. This was the strong alcohol produced by Goodwill Lane. It was semi-industrial alcohol and tasteless, but it had a strong after-effect. After waking up, one's head would feel like it was about to explode. Only the 2 of them could drink it. Old General Ma furrowed his brows and said, "The little princess is still here. Why are you drinking wine? Get people to remove all these and serve the fruits and pastries. Didn't His Majesty just give you some fresh fruits yesterday? Serve them quickly." Only then did old General Shui realize that there was a special guest today. He hurriedly said, Yes, take all these away and replace them with some fruits and pastries. Bring out the fruits that His Majesty rewarded us yesterday and instruct the kitchen to prepare some good dishes." "Be quick." Old General Shui returned to his seat and looked at Li Xian. He asked, "His Highness hasn't left the capital yet, right?" Li Xian nodded and said, "His Majesty is holding a banquet in Hibiscus Garden during the Lantern Festival. Father and Mother will only leave after the Lantern Festival. Every year, there would be a grand court conference. If there were no important matters, the important officials from the various prefectures would return to the capital on this day to report on their work, achievements, and an audience with the emperor. The various kings would also enter the capital. The Grand Court Conference was the highest standard of court ceremonies. It was equivalent to the year-end summary and annual meeting, of course, among those princes and princes, the king of Shu was an exception. He had just arrived at his fief not long ago, and there were many things waiting to be done. How to harm the people of Shu was the first problem he had to solve. How could he have the time to attend the imperial court meeting? Li Yi was not sure what had happened during the Grand Court Conference. As the dean of the Mathematics Academy, although he had also attended the Grand Court Conference, he had stayed up late the night before and had woken up very early in the morning. When he reached the main hall, he was extremely sleepy and slept from beginning to end with the help of old General Shue's pillar. These gifts had been extorted by him at that time. From that day onwards, there would be lantern shows every day until the Lantern Festival. 3 days before the Lantern Festival, even the curfew would be cancelled. The entire capital would be brightly lit and people would sing throughout the night. It was the busiest day of the year in the capital. Li Yi had also received an invitation. On the night of the Lantern Festival, the old emperor had set up a banquet in Hibiscus Garden. He had invited hundreds of officials and dignitaries of the capital. There were mountains and rivers in Hibiscus Garden. The scale of the banquet was similar to that of a large-scale garden party. However, it was much grander than the one held in the palace. The old generals gathered and chatted for a while before the topic shifted to the war. Sometimes, when it came to the art of war, they would ask Li Yi and Li Xian a few questions. If they were to personally command the troops on the battlefield, the two of them together would not even be able to compare to a finger of any one of them. However, if they were to use their mouths to talk, Li Yi alone would be able to make them wonder if they had lived their entire lives as dogs. Very quickly, the old generals set their sights on Li Xian. They had fought for their entire lives, but when it came to their contributions to the Jing kingdom and the art of war, they couldn't compare to this little brat. Naturally, they wouldn't look for trouble. Since he had nothing better to do, he played chess with the arrogant Lolita and watched Li Xian being scolded like a dog. It was quite an interesting experience. The old housekeeper returned very quickly. An old servant placed a small bamboo basket on the table. Beside it were 2 plates that seemed to be filled with pastries. Li Yi glanced at the bamboo basket. There were 2 peaches and 1 pear in the basket. Even in the capital, it was not easy to eat these fruits in the middle of winter. Even for the royal family, this was very rare. You guys came at the right time today. These were just bestowed by His Majesty yesterday. Old General Shui waved his hand and laughed. You can't eat them anywhere else. The arrogant Lolita glanced at Li Yi. She was almost sick of eating these fruits these days. Last time, she had brought a basket back for her father and mother. The peaches and pears in front of her, no matter how she looked at them, looked like the fruits in the basket were a little wilted, but they were still much better than those so-called fruits that tasted no different from cotton wool in the cellar. At that time, they did not invest too much. They did manage to produce fruits that were out of season, but the output was not high. Normally, it was only enough for their family to eat. Last time, the arrogant Lolita extorted a basket of fruits. Even she felt that it was a little excessive. The next day, she brought 2 carriages of tributes from the palace as compensation. To Li Yi and the arrogant Lolita, these things were not rare at all. However, they could not let old General Shui down. He took out a small knife from the arrogant Lolita's bag and cut the fruit open. He took it over and said, "Everyone, have a taste." Old General Shui waved his hand and said, "This little thing is not even enough to fill the teeth of us old fellows. You guys go ahead and eat." Li Yi could only take the bamboo basket back. From the corner of his eye, he saw a few little heads poking out from the door. They looked at the bamboo basket and swallowed their saliva. After being stunned for a moment, he walked over and handed it to them. "You guys take it and eat." The few children looked at Li Yi and then at the bamboo basket. There was a clear desire in their eyes, but they did not stretch out their hands for a long time. Old General Shui stood up and looked at the children. "You little fellows, what are you doing here?" Of the 3 children, the oldest was 7 or 8 years old and the youngest was only 5 or 6 years old. They walked in and called out with their heads lowered, "Grandpa." Old General Shui only had 1 wife, but all 3 of his sons had prospered and had many children. This was usually the case for a family of generals. After all, no one could guarantee that they would always win on the battlefield. They had to leave a legacy for the family. Li Yi stuffed the bamboo basket into the hands of the older child and said, "Eat, eat. Come in." The tsundere loli walked over and took out 2 fresh and tender pears from her bag and placed them in the frame. This bag was sewn by Rui for her. It could be slung over her shoulder and there were many compartments inside. Li Yi did not know what was in her bag. She looked at old General Shui and blinked her eyes. "Shanning did not bring any gifts, so I'll give these to my brother and sister." Old General Shui was stunned for a moment, then he laughed and said, "Good, good. Our Shanning has grown up and knows to bring gifts." As if she had thought of something, the arrogant Lolita took out a square paper bag from her bag and said, "Oh yes, there's also this." "What is this?" Old General Shui asked with a smile. The arrogant Lolita thought for a moment and said, "Sir said that this is called instant noodles. It won't spoil no matter how long it is kept. It's an essential medicine for traveling, marching, fighting, and killing." With that, she opened the paper bag and broke off a small piece of the flatbread. She put it in her mouth and chewed a few times. She mumbled, "You can eat it directly now. But it tastes better if you soak it in hot water for a while. It won't spoil no matter how long it is kept." Old General Shui looked at her and asked, "If it's stored properly, it should last for a few months." Li Yi stood at the side and said after some thought. This was when Yong Ning wanted to eat instant noodles. He made them at home. The craftsmanship was naturally simple, but the taste was not bad. However, because there were no preservatives, the shelf life was definitely not as long as in the future. Considering the level of sealing, the shelf life could not reach half a year, but it should be at least half a year. Crash. The sound of a chair falling could be heard. Li Yi turned around and saw Li Xian sitting on the chair with a dumbfounded look. The few old generals stood up and looked at him like hungry wolves. Can it really be stored for 3 months? Old General Ma's eyes were wide open. It should be possible, should be? Definitely. Can it be eaten just by rinsing it? Old General Song asked with a serious face. You can eat it directly. Of course, rinsing it will fill you up even more, but it needs hot water. Where would we get hot water on the battlefield? Just prepare clean water and bring some quicklime. No matter what kind of water you put it in, it will heat up quickly. If you have any leftover quicklime, you can put it in your pocket and sprinkle it on the enemy's eyes when they are unprepared. It's an essential medicine for traveling, marching, fighting, and killing. Not only will it fill your stomach, but the soldiers will also have the strength to fight. Old General Shui looked at him with his eyes wide open. That's not difficult. Prepare dried meat and dehydrated vegetables. When the time comes, we can add them directly. The nutrition will definitely keep up. In other words, this can be used as army rations. It should be used in emergencies. Fried food can't be eaten often either. There are many things that can be used as army rations. As for fast food, the main problem is to seal it. It can be made into canned food and wrapped in aluminum foil. Why didn't you say so earlier? Do you know how many years we have been troubled by the problem of army rations? You guys didn't ask. In the middle of the hall, Li Yi sat on a chair and was surrounded by a few old generals. It was as though they were interrogating him. Li Xian was watching from the side, rejoicing in Li Yi's misfortune. Just a moment ago, Li Yi had left him to die, but he didn't expect the tables to turn. Old General Shui was fuming. He slammed the table and said angrily, "Since you know how to solve the problem of army rations, why are you still hiding it? If you were my disciple, I would beat you to death." When it was time to be a coward, he had to be a coward. For example, when he was facing Mississippi Lu, his body wouldn't be able to take it if he didn't be a coward. When it was time to be tough, he had to be tough. For example, now, he had such a huge library in his head. There were many things he knew. He was helpless. If he had to spit out everything, he wouldn't be able to do anything for the rest of his life. He would probably have to devote himself to the great feudal construction of the Jing kingdom for the next few decades. Li Yi slammed the table and stood up. He pointed at Li Xian and said, "He has been eating instant noodles for the past few days. Didn't he not think of it? Didn't old General Shui want to find a disciple to beat? It didn't matter if he wasn't his disciple. There was someone who was." The gloating smile on Li Xian's face froze. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva and rushed out like a gust of wind. The Shui family's banquet was very simple. This was something Li Yi could guess from the moment he walked into the Shui family's house. It seemed that the salary of the civil servants in ancient times wasn't high. Even an old general of this level didn't live in poverty, but it was far from what he had imagined. Prime Minister Qin was like this, and so was old General Shui. Even though their families were too powerful, in general, if they didn't have any other means, even the families of the court officials wouldn't have it easy. "Kid, you really know a lot of things." This old man didn't expect that there would be so much knowledge about military rations. Old General Shui tilted his head back and drank a big bowl of wine. He said angrily, "Those rotten scholars aren't even comparable to a kid. Did they waste their decades of studying? This old man doesn't believe it. You haven't been to the battlefield before. How do you know all this?" Old General Ma was puzzled. Old General Shui curled his lips and said, "Old man Ma, have you forgotten? This kid can even write that kind of military strategy. How can a mere military rations be a problem?" Old General Ma's old face immediately revealed a look of realization. He said, "Could it be that this was also imparted by the military expert who taught you the art of war?" Li Yi nodded and said, "Yes, it was a bitter and cold winter." Li Xian was stunned for a moment. He asked, "Wasn't it a scorching hot summer?" Li Yi looked at him and asked, "Didn't you say that it was easier to convince people in winter?" "Oh." Li Xian finally remembered and said, "I remember now. In the end, it was changed to winter." Li Yi glanced at him. He was so forgetful at such a young age. He had to pay attention to the frequency of sexual intercourse in the future. Shaking his head, he turned to look at the old generals and continued, "It was a bitter and cold winter." Chapter 585. Old Shui, do you believe the words of this brat? Old General Ma looked at old General Shui and asked. Old General Shui gulped down another bowl of wine and said, "It doesn't matter whether I believe him or not. What's important is that the issue of rations has been resolved. In the future, our soldiers will have less to worry about. Tomorrow, I will go to the emperor to claim credit for this brat. In my opinion, if he does a few more things like this, his title of nobility should be promoted." Li Yi's current title of nobility was a county earl. If he were to go up a little, he would be a county marquis. At the level of a duke, he would be considered a noble among the nobles. Among the old generals, old General Shui and old General Ma had fought for their entire lives and achieved countless military merits. As for the other old generals, they had great prestige in the imperial court, but their title of nobility was only that of a county marquis. How can you monopolize the matter of claiming credit? Old General Ma snorted coldly and said, "Tomorrow, the few of us old fellows will go with you." Li Yi was a little stunned as he watched from the side. These old men seemed to have forgotten something. Didn't they need to ask for his permission to claim credit? In reality, he was already very indifferent to things like titles and ranks. After the old emperor passed away, these would all be for naught. He might as well reward them with a few million taels of silver. Cough, old General Shui, there's no need to claim credit. Li Yi put down his chopsticks and said, "Why don't you discuss with His Majesty and see if it can be converted into silver?" Converted into what? Old General Shui raised his eyebrows. "There's no need to claim credit." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "It's all for the country. You see, I am already a county earl at such a young age. If I were to be rewarded, there would be many people in the imperial court who would be dissatisfied. It would not be good for the stability of the imperial court. It's better to convert it into silver, forget it." Bullsh *T. Old General Shui fiercely slammed the table and said, meritorious service should be rewarded, and crimes should be punished. This has been the case since ancient times. What are they unconvinced of? If they have the ability, they should help His Majesty solve the problem of military rations. If they don't have the ability, then stop talking nonsense. If anyone dares to say anything else, I will crush his balls. The proud Lolita tugged at Li Yi's sleeve and asked, "Sir, what is an egg?" Cough. Old General Ma coughed heavily. He glared fiercely at old General Shui and said, even though old Shui usually spouts a lot of nonsense, what he said is reasonable. Meritorious service should be rewarded. You don't have to worry. If anyone dares to utter a single word of nonsense in the imperial court, I will crush them. Cough, cough. I will have a good talk with them. Li Yi was extremely unwilling. The old emperor had conferred him the title of county earl, and many people in the court were already dissatisfied. If he were to be promoted even further, what would those officials who had worked hard for the country for their entire lives but had yet to obtain a title of nobility think? It wasn't his style to offend people as much as possible. Being hated by so many people for no reason wasn't his style. When he returned home today, he would probably have to stay up for another hour to write a book called The Complete Collection of Military Rations. He didn't know what the old emperor would reward him this time. As for silver, there was probably no hope. The old emperor was stingy. He could even name 10,000 copper coins as 10,000 gold coins. There was no way he would get a generous reward. Could it be that he owed the old Li family a lot in his previous life? Not only did they work so hard to build an academy, but they also had to write a book, eat and drink with him. Now, they even had to raise 2 daughters for him. What exactly was he after? Forget it, he didn't want to think about it anymore. He lowered his head and ate. The Shui family's food was very bland, and the taste was average. The plate of wild vegetables in front of Li Yi was quite to his liking. When he was young, he liked to eat the wild vegetables his grandmother dug out from the ground. It should be called the steamed vegetables. He ate it with porridge and it was almost a fixed meal every day. Although the taste was different now, it brought back many memories. The proud Lolita couldn't stand the Shui family's food. She often ate at the Li family and was cooked by Li Yi or Rui. Now, she even disliked the royal chef's cooking. Seeing that Li Yi only ate the dish in front of him, she rolled her eyes and took a big bite. However, it was so bitter that she almost vomited. Generally speaking, families with a bit of status would have more etiquette requirements. They didn't talk when eating or sleeping. The proud Lolita before coming to the Li family knew this very well. However, the old generals didn't know what table etiquette was. They drank from bowls and ate meat. The problem of military rations had been solved, and they were happy. As they chatted about everything, Li Yi thought of something and suddenly said, I wonder if the old generals are interested in the military rations business? Military rations are military rations, and business is business. How can these two things be related? Old General Shui asked with a frown. Li Yi shook his head and said, military rations are also rations. Why can't we do business? Moreover, it's something to eat. If the soldiers and generals can eat it, the commoners can eat it too. Naturally, we can do business. Instant noodles were good stuff. They had created many sales records in the future and were something that even brats couldn't live without. There was almost no need to consider the risk when doing business. He also saw that the Shui family's situation didn't seem to be that good. He guessed that the old generals were probably in the same situation. These old generals usually protected him in the imperial court. If there was anything they could help with, he would naturally help them. Moreover, there was no better partner for this business than a family of generals. The old generals also understood what he meant. Old General Ma looked at him and asked, You mean that we should produce our own military rations and do business with His Majesty? Not just with His Majesty. If we produce enough military rations, we can also sell it to the commoners. The old generals were speechless. They looked at each other and saw a hint of desire in each other's eyes. They naturally knew the situation of their family better than anyone else. As long as they, the old generals, were still around, the entire residence would still be able to get by. However, if a few more years passed, everything would be uncertain. When it came to arranging military formations and fighting on the battlefield, they were all top-notch experts. However, when it came to doing business, they knew nothing at all. The speed at which the family of generals declined was even faster than the other families of civil officials. They had to leave behind more things for their descendants before they were buried in the earth. Is this really feasible? Old General Ma looked at Li Yi and asked. Before Li Yi could speak, Old General Shui laughed and said, he might not be able to do other things, but this fellow is a top-notch expert in doing business. However, doing business with His Majesty, won't we be taking advantage of His Majesty? Old General Shui stood up and paced back and forth in the hall. As an official, isn't this disloyal to His Majesty? Old General Ma nodded and stood up, saying, eating the Emperor's salary, sharing the Emperor's worries, and solving the problem of military rations is what we, the officials, should do. How can we use this to discuss business with His Majesty? Li Yi looked at them and asked tentatively, so, generals, how much silver do you intend to offer? 1,000 taels, Old General Shui said. This old man is not as rich as the Shui family. Even if I scrape together everything and sell everything I have, I should be able to gather 1,000 taels, Old General Ma said with a smile. This old man will also offer 1,000 taels, Old General Song said while stroking his beard. This old man will offer 800. This old man will also offer 800. Li Yi put down his chopsticks. Deal. Chapter 586. The few old generals were really loyal to their king and patriotism. In less than 5 minutes, they had already decided on the distribution of the loot, and the distribution of benefits. That. Li Xian scratched his head and said, I'll pay 50,000 taels too. He knew better than all the other old generals that he could earn a lot of money by following Li Yi. There was no reason for him not to participate in such a thing where he could earn money by lying down. Old General Shui and Old General Ma looked at each other. The former waved his hand at Li Xian impatiently and said, go away. They could only get 1,000 taels by pooling together, but Li Xian offered 50,000 taels the moment he opened his mouth. The more he offered, the more points he would get. When the time came, would the few old men fight for the soup? Li Yi patted Li Xian's shoulder with a smile and said, don't worry, we're brothers. How could I forget about you? Li Xian was touched. He patted his chest and said, tell me, what can I do? Didn't I just say that we're going to make canned food and pack it with aluminum foil? It's not easy to make aluminum foil. Forget it, I'll leave the sealing to you. If the sealing is not good, the rations will spoil easily. Li Yi looked at him with a smile and said, also, we haven't tested whether instant noodles will work. Other forms of rations are more feasible in theory. Of course, there are still some problems that need to be solved. The Academy of Science specializes in solving such problems. I'll leave these to you too. We're all brothers, don't stand on ceremony. Good, that's great. Old General Shui immediately patted the table. He was very satisfied with Li Yi's arrangement. The touched expression on Li Xian's face froze. He raised his head and took a look at Li Yi. Only then did he realize that Li Yi's smile was sinister and there was a chilly wind blowing from all directions, in order to teach Li Xian what retribution was, what it meant to not seek death, what it meant to not seek death, what it meant to be a good person would be rewarded, and that the time had not yet come for retribution. Li Yi had put in a lot of effort. The old generals were still very interested in the matter of military rations. They then asked Li Yi a few related questions. Before troops and horses were mobilized, rations and fodder had to be prepared first. Rations were the lowest standard to maintain the combat effectiveness of an army. Only when they were full would they have the strength to fight, and the concept of military rations in this world was only to fill their stomachs. However, from the point of view of the future, the requirement to quickly fill one's stomach was a little too low. Not only did the soldiers have to eat their fill, but they also had to eat well. They had to be nutritious, and they even had to eat happily and happily. These theories were very unfamiliar to the old general. However, although they had never heard of such a saying before, they felt that what Li Yi said was very reasonable. A simple meal and a delicious meal gave people a different feeling. If the soldiers ate well, their morale would naturally increase. According to him, military rations was also a field of knowledge that required a large group of people to put in a lot of effort to study it. This task was naturally handed over to the Academy of Science to complete. Using instant noodles as military rations was also an idea that Li Yi came up with on the spur of the moment. After all, this had never been done in the future. He would let Li Xian verify the feasibility first. Military rations were not suitable, but naughty children's rations were the most suitable. Although the food is good, this name is really too casual. Old General Shui stroked his beard and shook his head. Instant noodles, convenience. How can you talk about eating with convenience? Isn't it disgusting? Why don't we call it killing enemy noodles? Old General Shui thought for a while and slapped the table. Eating it will allow you to fight bravely. How about that? Vulgar, unbearably vulgar. Whenever old General Shui suggested something, old General Ma would always oppose it. He immediately shook his head and said, in my opinion, why don't we call it strength noodles? Strength noodles is not bad? Old General Song shook his head and said, it's better to call it hibiscus noodles. Killing enemy noodles, strength noodles, Master Ma noodles, and Master Shui noodles were all better than this. It would be strange if such a name wasn't bad. Although hibiscus noodles could be a little better, Li Yi had already thought of the name and wouldn't allow anyone to change it. Little Raccoon. He looked at the few old generals and said, Little Raccoon instant noodles, it's decided. Although the old generals were still a little dissatisfied with the name, they couldn't do anything since Li Yi had made up his mind. After walking out of the Shui mansion, Li Yi let out a long sigh of relief. At the same time, he was also extremely glad that he brought the Tsundra Lolita along. Otherwise, the two of them would definitely be walking out. He patted her head and said, come, let's go back to eat spicy prawns. Sure. The Tsundra Lolita didn't eat well just now, so she agreed with him. Although Li Xian wanted to go with them, he had to face the problem of how to deal with the military rations. Now he had to go back and think about this matter. At the same time, a strong sense of regret arose in his heart. At that time, he was really blinded by greed. He should have known that he shouldn't provoke anyone. After entering the middle of the first month, the atmosphere of the new year not only didn't fade, but it became even more intense. This was because with the approaching of the Lantern Festival, the annual Lantern Festival in the capital also began. From the 10th, the curfew time was delayed by a whole hour. Once night fell, the entire capital became a sea of joy. On the 15th, the curfew would be directly lifted for 3 days. From the officials and nobles to the ordinary people, everyone could enjoy the nightlife of the capital to their heart's content. Son-in-law, second miss, what's the answer to this riddle? On the noisy street, people came and went. The little maid stood outside the crowd and looked inside. She suddenly turned her head and asked Li Yi. Today was the 14th of the first month, only 1 day left before the most lively Lantern Festival. At night, the prosperity of the capital had reached its peak in recent days. Second miss. The crowded street was unusually noisy. Li Yi casually said, go and ask second miss if she knows. Xiao Huan really ran to the side and asked. After a while, she ran back, shook her head and said, son-in-law, second miss doesn't know either. Li Yi gently knocked on her head and said, stupid, this is the Z in posture. Oh. The little maid responded and squeezed into the crowd. After a while, she came out with a lantern. Li Yi looked at her and asked, don't we have a lot of them at home? Why do you still need to take them? Xiao Huan hugged the lantern and said, this is for Bing Ning. She said she also wants to play on the street at night, but she can't come out because she's in the palace. I'll take one for her next time. The capital had been quite busy these days. For safety reasons, Yong Ning and the proud Lolita didn't leave the palace. Tonight, they were going to the Lantern Festival with Rui and Xiao Huan. Tomorrow, they would have to go to the Lotus Garden to attend the banquet. Eldest Miss and Second Miss are in front. Son-in-law, let's go quickly. Xiao Huan hugged the lantern with one hand and grabbed Li Yi's wrist with the other. She squeezed forward. Miss, an empty courtyard waiting for a child to return. What is this? Xiao Chui stood under a row of lanterns and pointed at a lantern she liked. When she turned around, she found that Miss was looking in a certain direction in the crowd. She waved her hand in front of her eyes and said, Miss. Tsing Zumo came back to her senses. When she looked again, the figure she saw was no longer in the crowd. She asked, what is it? An empty courtyard waiting for a child to return, what is this? Xiao Chui asked again. Tsing Zumo thought about it and said, it's a Li character. Oh. Xiao Chui nodded and memorized the answer. She planned to win that lantern later. She also liked the design of the lantern next to it and asked again, then, if it is destroyed once, it is a careless heart. What is this? If it is destroyed once, it is a careless heart. Tsing Zumo thought about it again and said, this is. She suddenly looked at Xiao Chui with a bit of anger and said, one lantern is enough. Why do you need so many? After he finished speaking, he walked forward, leaving the young girl standing in the same place with the lantern in her arms with a baffled expression. Chapter 587. Little Raccoon. Emperor Jing chewed and swallowed what the proud Lolita had stuffed into his mouth. He nodded and said, the taste is good, but the name is too strange. Little Raccoon, it sounds nice. The proud Lolita took out a small notebook from her bag, opened a few pages, and showed a picture to Emperor Jing. She said, the teacher said this is the little raccoon. Isn't it cute? Emperor Jing pinched her face and said, our Shaoning is the cutest. The proud Lolita rolled her eyes and said, Father, Shaoning also wants to go to Hibiscus Garden at night. Father and mother are gone, and Shaoning is bored alone in the palace. Emperor Jing touched her head and said, go. Everyone will go tonight. Thank you, Father. The proud Lolita took out a fresh pear from her bag and put it on the table. Then she ran out quickly. Emperor Jing picked up the pear. His nails exerted a little force, and the juice overflowed. Although he was an emperor and had seen countless treasures, it was not until a few days ago that he saw such a fresh pear in winter. Changde stood behind and said, Your Majesty, the imperial physician said that eating pears is good for your body. I will send someone out of the palace to tell County Uncle Li to send a few fresh pears to the palace every day. I will send someone to cook them for you. Emperor Jing did not answer. He turned the pear in his hand over and over again and said, how can he know everything? He can even do things that go against the natural order. I don't believe that anyone can be born with knowledge. I also don't believe that many powerful people in my Jing kingdom line up at his door every winter, waiting for him to pick them up. All the evidence shows that 1.5 years ago, County Uncle Li was just a poor scholar in Li's village. Although he was a child of Li's family, he had been mediocre in the past 20 years. At most, he could be regarded as a teenager with intelligence, until last June, Changde said in a low voice. Until last June, he was taken to Willow Village and married his current wife. He seemed to be a completely different person. First, he cured Princess Ning's stubborn disease with candied haws, and then he offered divine punishment and horseshoes. He was so talented in poetry that he deserved the title of the first scholar in the Jing kingdom. He was so knowledgeable that he surpassed the great Wenzong of the Qi kingdom. He knew the art of war and medicine. Changde recounted everything that had happened to Li Yi in the past 1.5 years in one breath. Even a grandmaster could not help but gasp for breath. According to the village head, County Uncle Li seemed to have changed into another person after suffering from hysteria. Could it be that all of this is because of hysteria? So, it's a good thing that he suffered from hysteria? Emperor Jing paused and asked, did you find out anything about Willow Village? I have. Changde nodded and said, before Emperor Gaozu founded the Jing kingdom, Willow Village was once a bandit's nest. After Emperor Gaozu founded the country, he sent troops everywhere to suppress bandits in order to pacify the people. Willow Village became good at that time. For nearly 100 years, it has been hiding in that small village. However, the bloodline of the Liu family has always enjoyed a prestigious reputation in the martial arts world. Every few decades, one of them will be born, and they will always stir up quite a storm in the martial arts world. Li Yi's wife, on the other hand, is a grandmaster expert who has hidden her strength. Is that supreme master really so powerful? Emperor Jing asked with a trace of doubt on his face. Changde nodded and said, Your Majesty, you don't know that the so-called Supreme Master is a respectful title for those who have reached the advanced level of martial arts in Wulin. They are extremely powerful. They come and go without a trace. Even the imperial court will be extremely troublesome if they provoke one. Emperor Jing just asked casually about the Supreme Master in Wulin. The next moment, he changed the topic and said, I will draft the decree in a while. Do as the old generals say. Changde nodded and knew that His Majesty sympathized with the old generals. Although it was appropriate for them to handle the military provisions, it was most appropriate for the imperial court to handle it directly. He looked up at Emperor Jing and said, There are still a few hours before the banquet. Your Majesty, go and have a rest first. This time, His Majesty's illness lasted for a long time. He was sick for almost the whole winter. It was not until the weather became warm in the past 2 days that his body began to gradually recover. However, he could not be too tired. He needed to be energetic before he could attend the banquet in Furong Garden. Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, It's okay. I feel much better today. These days, I have missed a lot of court affairs. Pick a few important memorials and send them over. Changde's face showed helplessness, but he could only whisper, I will obey your Majesty. What? Send a basket of pears to the palace every day? Li Yi looked at the 2 eunuchs standing in the yard and resisted the urge to kick them out. He could accept the arrogant Lolita coming to eat a few from time to time. However, the old emperor wanted to kill them all. If they sent a basket of pears every day, they would have nothing to eat in 2 days. At most 2. Li Yi looked at them and said coldly. County Uncle Li, too. This servant can't report back. One of the eunuchs showed a difficult expression and said, 5, how about 5? From 1 basket to 5 so quickly, these 2 idiots obviously did not know how to bargain. Li Yi glanced at them and said, 2. Let's each take a step back. 4, how about 4? 2.5. I can't take any more. This is what His Majesty wants. Half is 2, in the end, the number of pears was 3. Li Yi always felt that the original oral decree should not be a basket. The old emperor could not be so shameless. This kind of thing could be done by Chang. He should have taken a tougher attitude just now. Otherwise, he could have saved 1.5. Soon, the 2 eunuchs were sent away. These insensible fellows were just combing Rui's hair. They were going to Hibiscus Garden to attend the banquet in the evening. The officials and dignitaries attending would also bring their families. As for the womenfolk, of course, the Empress would be the leader. This kind of super large party was only held twice a year. Although he was not very interested in this kind of banquet, he could not refuse. Who dared not to give face to the old emperor? Husband, when did you learn to comb your hair? Sitting in front of the dressing table, Rui looked at his reflection in the bronze mirror and asked. A few days ago, I used Xiaohuan to practice, Li Yi said casually. Therefore, combing hair depended on talent and had nothing to do with gender. In this matter, he could completely crush Mississippi Liu. Next time, I think it's better to ask Xiaohuan to come. Rui hesitated for a moment and said, if this kind of thing is spread out, the officials and dignitaries in the capital will laugh at you. A dignified county uncle cooking in the daily, it was already unusual among the dignitaries in the capital. There was no other county uncle in the whole capital, or even the whole Jing kingdom, who would comb a woman's hair. What's wrong with combing a wife's hair? This is a natural thing. Who dares to laugh at it? Li Yi curled his lips. He was least afraid of rumors. If anyone dared to laugh at it, tomorrow's front page of the capital newspaper would be about some dignitaries having an illicit relationship with a sow after getting drunk. Compared to this matter, a county uncle combing his wife's hair was nothing. "Goodbye, son-in-law." "Goodbye, miss." Xiaohuan stood at the door and waved at the carriage that was going far away. Only when the carriage disappeared did she walk back in disappointment. These days, son-in-law and miss felt a little different. They often went out to play without her and Second Mississippi. In Second Miss's words, they were more tired of each other. Chapter 588. Apart from the Imperial Palace, Hibiscus Garden was the largest royal garden in the capital city, covering an area of dozens of hectares. In it, there were not only magnificent palaces second only to the Imperial Palace, but also beautiful mountains and rivers. It was a summer resort for several generations of emperors. As a royal forbidden garden, outsiders were not qualified to step into it without the emperor's decree. Li Yi had never entered the Hibiscus Garden, and he did not know if the Hibiscus Garden of the Jing Kingdom and the Hibiscus Garden of the Tang Dynasty, which he had been to countless times in his previous life, were the same place. However, this possibility was very small. The structure of the world today, and even the topography and names of places, were difficult to match with certain things in his memory. The carriage stopped before it got close to the gate. It stopped on a spacious field. Li Yi and Ru Yi walked over on foot. There were countless guards outside the garden. At a glance, one could see several rows of armored guards patrolling around. Tonight, almost all the high-ranking officials of the Jing Kingdom were here. Of course, the security work had to be raised to the highest level. Otherwise, if some lawbreakers were to take care of all these people, the Jing Kingdom would be in chaos without the need for other countries to do anything. At that time, they would only need to send troops to take over the territory. After handing over the invitation and walking into the garden, they realized that there were so many officials and nobles in Jing Kingdom, and most of them were unfamiliar. Fortunately, the garden was very large. Even if not all places were open tonight, it would not be crowded even if the number of people was several times larger. "Husband, I'll go there first." Tonight, the men and women were still separated. After entering, there were maids guiding the women to another palace. Tonight, the Hibiscus Garden was ablaze with lights. In the hall not far away, there was a faint sound of stringed instruments. It was said that tonight, the singers and dancers of the musical house, as well as some highly skilled palace performers, would come here to perform for the ministers. Usually, only the royal family could enjoy such performances. Li Yi was not very interested in those performances. There were not many people in the distant corridor on the water. He walked over and found an empty pavilion. Looking at the sparkling lights on the water, he picked up a piece of cake from the plate on the table and threw it into his mouth. After eating one piece, he had no desire to eat a second one. Ruoqing's osmanthus cake was the most suitable for his taste. It was just that he hadn't been to Willow Alley recently and hadn't eaten in a long time. On the other side of the corridor, a few figures glanced over as they passed by. One of them stopped in his tracks and his gaze froze. "Big Brother Qin, what's wrong?" A 15 or 16-year-old youth behind him asked in confusion. When the others followed his gaze, their expressions also became slightly unnatural. They twisted their buttocks, and an indescribable part of their bodies seemed to start to ache faintly. The dessert of the dining hall was average, but the other plate of broad beans tasted good. It was a little cold sitting here in winter. Li Yi planned to eat this plate and then go in. Before he ate half, he suddenly heard a voice in his ear. "You're Li Yi?" The voice was crisp and clear. Presumably, the speaker was young. Li Yi turned his head and saw a young man standing behind him. He looked to be about 15 or 16 years old. The light here was a little dim, but he could see that he had red lips and white teeth. He looked quite handsome. "Who are you?" The young man's voice was angry, and he didn't look friendly. It had been a long time since he caused trouble, and he was a little itchy. Besides, the plate of broad beans wasn't finished yet. It was good to have someone to talk to. Li Yi looked up at him and asked. I'm Wang Dan. The young man crossed his arms and said in an imposing manner. Oh, you little bastard, what do you want? Li Yi looked at him and asked. There were many powerful officials with the surname Wang in the capital. He didn't know which family this spoiled brat was from. I'm Wang Dan, not a bastard. The young man's face turned red. He had been teased like this many times since he was young, and it had almost become a sore spot for him. His chest rose and fell, and even his voice was trembling. No wonder Big Brother Qin said that. This person called Li Yi was really despicable and rude to the extreme. The young man's eyes were fierce. You're the one who used dirty tricks to harm Big Brother Qin and the others? Big Brother Qin? As if thinking of something, Li Yi tilted his head and glanced over. He saw a few slightly familiar figures slowly walking along the shore of the waterside pavilion. 2 or 3 of them were looking in his direction. When he looked at the young man again, there was a pitiful expression on his face. He kept calling out Big Brother Qin with righteous indignation and wanted to seek justice for him. However, his Big Brother Qin didn't tell him that the person he was questioning was the scourge of Jingdo. He had beaten the Duke and the Prince, and could kill 10 brats like him with one finger. Which family are you from? Li Yi couldn't help but feel curious about his background. What, are you afraid? The young man raised his head as if he was very confident in his background. Is it the Wang family? Li Yi looked at him and asked. How do you know? The young man asked with a shocked expression. Li Yi threw a broad bean into his mouth and sighed. He stood up and walked outside. No wonder Qin Yu and the others were using him as a tool. This child's brain was probably damaged. Stop. The young man came back to his senses. Seeing that Li Yi was about to walk out, he quickly chased after him. If something really happens to Wang Dan, I'm afraid it will be hard to explain to the Wang family. A young man beside Qin Yu glanced at the 2 figures that were about to disappear in front of him and said. The Wang family. Qin Yu shook his head and didn't say anything else. Another person opened his mouth and said, the Wang family. The Wang family is already standing opposite the king of Shu. What difference does it make whether we explain or not? Stop. Li Yi walked out of the long corridor on the other side of the water. Hearing the panting voice behind him, he turned his head and asked, is there anything else? You. I. The young man panted heavily. He pointed at him and was about to speak when he suddenly froze. Yes, what did he want to say? He had just heard that Brother Qin and the others had been harmed by Li Yi and had been bedridden at home for a few months. Hence, he had rushed over angrily to seek justice for them. However, how was he going to seek justice for them? He really hadn't thought about it. Xiao Dan, why are you together? Li Xian and another young man walked over from behind and asked in surprise when they saw Li Yi and the young man. My name is Wang Dan, not Xiao Dan. The young man turned around and said through gritted teeth, forgetting about his conflict with Li Yi. Uncle Li, we meet again. The young man beside Li Xian cupped his fists at Li Yi. Hello, Brother Wang. Li Yi also cupped his fists at Wang Yong. Big brother, you know this guy? The young man was surprised. What do you mean by this guy and that guy? Wang Yong's face darkened and he said, I told you not to mix around with those people. If you don't listen to me, I'll send you back to the Wang family in 2 days. Big brother. The young man looked at him in disbelief. His big brother had always doted on him since he was young. This reprimand stunned him. However, he didn't dare to speak anymore. Compared to the Wang family, the capital city was much more interesting. He grew up in the capital city and only stayed there for a few days during festivals. If he was sent back, he couldn't imagine what his life would be like in the future. It's okay for a kid to be naughty. Just give him a beating. Verbal violence shouldn't be used as it was very damaging to a child's heart. Li Yi patted the young man's shoulder and said with a smile. The young man named Wang Dan immediately grimaced in pain. It wasn't clear if he was in pain or hatred. Chapter 589. They didn't expect this Wang Dan to be from the Wang family of Luochuan. His status wasn't low either. Although he wasn't the eldest son, he was the younger brother of the future head of the Wang family, Wang Yong. Of course, he was also Li Xian's brother-in-law. It was surprising that Li Xian's brother-in-law was hanging out with Qin Yu and the others. Furthermore, it seemed like this brother-in-law wasn't happy with Li Xian as his brother-in-law. There were too many people attending tonight's banquet. Not only were there officials and nobles from the capital, but their children were also included. After the court conference, the officials from all over the capital hadn't left yet. Naturally, the palace couldn't accommodate so many people. Most of them didn't have the right to enter. This included Qin Yu and many other hedonistic young masters in the capital. They could only eat and drink outside the palace. Even though the Wang family was one of the largest families in the Jing kingdom, the two juniors were only able to sit in a remote corner. If they moved a little further, they would be sitting outside the palace. Li Xian's seat was naturally in front. Although Li Yi didn't usually attend court, his position couldn't be measured by common sense. It was extremely close to the front. Perhaps someone had arranged it, but it was actually connected to Li Xian's. At this moment, there was no one in the main seat at the front. The dance in the center of the palace was extremely beautiful. Everyone was enjoying it while laughing and chatting. There weren't many days in the year when they could relax like this. In a certain corner of the hall, the young man named Wang Dan pouted his lips, his face full of arrogance. "Are you unhappy?" Wang Yong asked his younger brother. "Humph." Wang Dan snorted coldly. It was clearly written on his face. Wang Yong knocked him on the head and said, "Even father values Uncle Li very much. What do you know at such a young age? He's a bad guy." Wang Dan said coldly as he glanced in a certain direction in the palace. "Bad guy?" The smile on Wang Yong's face disappeared. He said word by word, "Wang Dan, do you know who you are?" Wang Dan had never seen his elder brother show such an expression. His body trembled and his face paled. Wang Yong looked at him and said seriously, "What happened just now? Tell me in detail. Don't hide anything." Wang Dan shivered and said, It's Big Brother Qin and the others." A moment later, after listening to his story, Wang Yong looked at him with an unconcealable look of disappointment on his face and said, "Father and I had high hopes for you. I didn't expect you to be stimulated by such a clumsy method. You really disappoint me." Big Brother Qin and the others. Wang Dan had just opened his mouth when Wang Yong waved his hand and said, "Putting aside the fact that they have ulterior motives, even if they are truly upright, they are still on the King of Shu's side. The King of Shu's failed marriage proposal to your sister has already set himself against our Wang clan. As the legitimate son of the Wang clan, don't tell me you haven't thought of these things?" Wang Dan curled her lips and said, "The King of Shu is no match for him." "Why did father, shut up?" Wang Yong's voice turned cold. Even the surrounding people looked over. Wang Dan immediately retracted his neck and didn't say another word. His Highness and County Uncle Li are outstanding talents of the younger generation. They are already famous in the capital at such a young age. What right do you have to say such words? Let's not talk about the academy and the science academy. After listening to his brother's story of Li Yi and Li Xian, Wang Dan's face revealed a shocked expression. He looked in a certain direction again. Was the cheap brother-in-law he had always looked down on and the unreasonable person he had just met so powerful? So what? In a few years, I'll be even more powerful than them. Wang Dan curled his lips and said, but his tone had already softened. Let's not talk about a few years later. Wang Yong looked at him and said, what you need to worry about is half a month later. Why? Wang Dan turned his head and asked in confusion. The family used a lot of resources to let you enter the mathematics academy without taking the exam. Wang Yong looked at him and said, half a month later will be the day of admission, and the supervisor of the academy is the guy you mentioned just now. Wang Dan's expression froze. He rubbed his slightly numbed shoulder and looked in a certain direction in the hall. His heart fell into a bottomless abyss. It must be in this bowl. That's not right. There was nothing under this bowl just now. Does Sir know magic, like Sun Wukong? The hall was filled with singing and dancing. In a small area in front of them, there were screams and cheers coming from time to time. The proud Lolita came over with her younger brothers and sisters. They were shocked by Li Yi's close-up magic. It was nothing more than putting the beans under the bowl for them to guess, using some techniques to transfer the beans or making something out of nothing, making beans appear in the empty bowl. This kind of simple magic trick could only deceive children. When it was performed in front of Rui and second Miss Lu, it all ended in failure. The little princes and princesses were making a big scene. Although they were not the focus of the entire hall, many people had been paying attention to them. Okay. That's it for today. Go and play. The feeling of being stared at by so many people was a little strange. Li Yi waved his hand and kept the bowl. Seeing that there were no more spells to watch, the princes dispersed. Only that Sundra Loli and Yong Ning stayed behind. Why hasn't it started? Li Yi turned his head and looked at Li Xian. It was really boring to sit here. Compared to this, the capital outside must be more lively. The proud Lolita interrupted, Father is not feeling well. He is resting in the back hall. Li Yi sighed. He had planned to go watch the lantern show with Rui after this. The lantern show on the day of the Lantern Festival was far from the previous ones. If he missed it, he would have to wait until next year. He didn't know if the Empress had finished. Otherwise, he could slip away in advance. With so many people, no one would notice if one or two people slipped away. With this thought in mind, an unfamiliar young man walked over and cupped his hands to Li Xian, saying, Long time no see. Li Xian was startled, then returned the greeting, saying, Your Highness, Prince Qi, long time no see. The proud Lolita looked at the young man and asked in surprise, Is it Brother Prince Qi? The young man smiled and said, After a few years, Shaning has grown so tall. Prince Qi said a few words to the proud Lolita, then his gaze fell on Li Yi. He asked, This must be Li Yi, County Earl Li? Li Yi stood up and cupped his hands, saying, Greetings, Your Highness. County Earl Li is too polite. Prince Qi smiled and said, Although I am not in the capital, I have heard of County Earl Li's deeds. County Earl Li is worthy of being an outstanding talent of the younger generation of our Jing Kingdom, a pillar of the country. I have long wanted to get to know you, but unfortunately, I can only meet you today. They were both princes, but this Prince Qi liked to speak the truth, leaving the hypocritical king of Shu far behind. Li Yi smiled and said, You flatter me, Your Highness, you flatter me. Prince Qi poured a cup of wine and cupped his hands, saying, County Earl Li has made many contributions to our Jing Kingdom. I admire you from the bottom of my heart. This cup of wine is to County Earl Li. Li Yi was startled, but he could only raise his cup. Although the Prince of Qi was not favored, he was still a genuine imperial prince. As soon as he walked over, quite a few gazes followed him. This time, King Shu lost his power and was sent away from the capital by His Majesty. He could not even return for the court meeting. The ones who benefited the most were naturally the other princes. Among the many princes, Prince Qi was one of the more respected ones in terms of status and background. Prince Qi made such a move under the watchful eyes of so many people. Was there any other meaning behind it? Could it be that he wanted to win over County Earl Li, who was favored by the emperor, and wanted to get the position of the Eastern Palace? Up to now, no one in the court dared to look down on this young county earl. However, all the officials who supported King Shu immediately became vigilant. After saying a few words and toasting, Prince Qi returned to his seat. However, Li Yi knew that Prince Qi did not just want to express his endless admiration for him. Of course, it was necessary to admire him. Apart from admiration, Prince Qi also wanted to win him over and help him fight for the throne. Prince Qi wants to win you over, Li Xian said with a frown. Li Yi glanced at him. Even a fool could see through Prince Qi's intention. Why does he want to win you over? A puzzled expression appeared on Li Xian's face. Aside from the academy, you don't have any real power or influence in the imperial court. You don't have much value, so why would he want to rope in someone who has no value? A worthless person. Li Yi smiled as he poured a cup of tea and took a sip. For some reason, this smile made Li Xian shudder. In the brightly lit hall, there seemed to be a chilly wind blowing from a corner. Chapter 590. The banquet of the royal family was actually very boring. Everything had to be done in an orderly manner. Even conversations had to be done in hushed voices, including the performances in the hall. Although they were exciting, they were just a formality. During this period, the old emperor and empress came by once and said a few simple words. They left without even watching a part of the dance. It was as if they were treating today, and everyone could eat and play as they pleased. All expenses would be deducted from the national treasury. The old emperor's health was really deteriorating day by day. If Li Yi's guess was correct, he must have forgotten who Lu Jimin was, let alone the imperial physician's instructions. With such a workaholic boss, the employees naturally couldn't be lazy. In the imperial court of the Jing kingdom, there was almost no such thing as extravagance or slacking. After the old emperor left, the atmosphere in the hall became visibly livelier. At this time, it was up to them to choose to continue watching the dance and chatting in the hall, or to go out and watch the lantern show in the garden. The arrogant Lolita brought Yong Ning out to play. Li Yi also stood up and walked out. Li Xian hurriedly stood up and asked, "Where are you going?" "It's so stuffy here." "I'm going out for a walk," Li Yi said casually. Li Xian also patted his clothes and stood up. "Then let's go together. I have a lot of things to ask you about the military rations." Li Yi looked at him and asked, "What military rations? How do you seal the military rations? How do you store it?" Li Xian looked at him and asked doubtfully. "That day at the Shui residence, you said it. Worthless people usually don't have a good memory." Li Yi shook his head. "I've forgotten how to store the military rations. These. I don't understand." With that, he walked out leisurely. Li Xian was stunned for a moment, then immediately chased after him. "Don't. Think carefully. I'm sure you'll remember, there were actually more seats outside the hall, extending out in a long line. More than 10 dancers danced in the wind, dancing elegantly." Li Yi saw a few familiar faces as soon as he walked out of the door. Young Duke Qin and a few of his followers were sitting outside, freezing like dogs in the cold night wind. They sniffled, and when they saw Li Yi walk out, their faces were filled with awkwardness, hatred, shame. Their expressions were rather complicated. Li Yi glanced at them and didn't look again. There was no sense of accomplishment playing with these guys. He decided to go to Rui's place. The Empress had accompanied the old emperor just now. A group of imperial guards rushed past them with solemn expressions. Li Xian was just fretting over how to cure Li Yi's amnesia. He stopped one of them and asked, "Where are you going?" The imperial guard replied, "Replying to your highness, imperial consort Nyang Nyang has lost her bracelet in the palace hall. This subordinate will bring people to investigate." Li Yi was still surprised that a random guard knew Li Xian. After a moment of surprise, he waved his hand and said, "Let's go and take a look." "Look at what?" Li Xian asked curiously. "Watching the show." "You too, you can't go in here." When Li Yi and Li Xian walked out of the hall, they were stopped by 2 guards. Li Xian took out a token from his waist and waved it in front of the guard. The imperial consort lost her bracelet. The Secret Intelligence Office is assisting in the investigation. If there is any delay, can you bear the responsibility? Your Highness, please. The guard recognized the token of the Secret Intelligence Office's commander. Although the hall was full of women and men were not allowed to enter, the situation was special. There was already a team of guards in front of them, so the people from the Secret Intelligence Office didn't dare to stop them. Inside the Jade Hall, it was quiet. Imperial Consort Shui looked at the broken bracelet on the ground. Her face was pale. A maid knelt on the ground and said while trembling, "Your Highness, this has nothing to do with me. This bracelet just fell from her body." The maid turned around and pointed at the woman not far away. All of the capital's noblewomen in the hall looked over. That woman was standing there with a calm expression on her face. What happened was simple. The women gathered together to talk about women's topics, not national affairs. For example, Rui Lane had released a new perfume that was popular regardless of age. A few days ago, he had spent a lot of money on a piece of jewelry that happened to be on clearance sale. It was worth the money. The rouge in the newly opened rouge shop in the capital was very good. After using it, he felt that he was very beautiful, and so on and so forth. Just now, the Imperial Consort showed everyone a jade bracelet. The jade bracelet was crystal clear, without a trace of impurity. It was extremely rare. As everyone knew, the largest jewelry shop in the Jing Kingdom was backed by the Chui family. Only Imperial Consort Chui could produce a jade bracelet of this quality. However, as the crowd passed it around, they talked. In the end, no one knew who it ended up in, but the jade bracelet mysteriously disappeared. None of the people present admitted that the jade bracelet was in their hands. This jade bracelet was so precious that it was rare in the world. Imperial Consort Shui immediately sent someone to inform the Imperial Guards. However, before the Imperial Guards arrived, the maid rushed back and accidentally bumped into someone. An item slipped out of the sleeve of the woman she bumped into and fell to the ground. It was Imperial Consort Shui's jade bracelet. For a moment, the way everyone looked at the woman changed. Although the jade bracelet was good, everyone present was a person of status. Stealing something like that was indeed beneath their status. Moreover, the jade bracelet was now destroyed. Looking at Imperial Consort Shui's expression, today's matter would not be settled peacefully. I remember now. Imperial Consort Shui's bracelet seemed to have been passed there. A woman said in a low voice. Who is this woman? I've never seen her before. The person next to her seems to be the crown princess of Prince Ning's family. That is the wife of County Earl Li. The perfume that everyone uses is from her family. No matter what, she is the County Earl's wife. How could she do such a despicable thing? It is really shameful. Countless whispers could be heard. Suddenly, a figure slowly walked out from the crowd. She looked at the maid and asked, Imperial Consort Shui and the other concubines are all here. Think carefully about what you should say and what you shouldn't say. Don't say a word of falsehood. Seeing the silver-haired, weak-looking woman stand out, many people's faces showed surprise. Didn't the Qin family and the Li family have deep enmity? At this moment, why would the third miss of the Qin family stand out to speak for her? At this moment, another person stood out and said, Sister Lu and I have been talking here. We can testify that she did not touch the jade bracelet at all. If it was only the third miss of the Qin family, it would not be a big deal. Now, even the crown princess of Prince Ning's family stood out to speak for her. The whispers in the hall suddenly became much quieter. This servant's words are all true. The maid stood up and pointed at the woman. She said, even if I had the guts, I would not dare. Slap. A resounding slap rang out in the hall. The maid covered her face with her hand, her face filled with disbelief. The silver-haired woman's weak temperament suddenly disappeared. She looked at the maid with a sullen face. How dare you, lowly maid? The dignified county earl's wife is not someone you can casually slander. The third miss of the Qin family had a gentle temperament. Because of the incident 20 years ago, she had been hurt to this day. Most people present knew that. However, they never thought that the gentle third miss of the Qin family would have such a cold and harsh side. Chapter 591. Miao Yu, several women of the Qin family who attended the banquet with her changed their expressions. They immediately came over and pulled her sleeves. The broken bracelet belonged to Imperial concubine Shui. The evidence pointed to the wife of Earl Li. If she stood up for her now, she would offend imperial concubine Shui. The Qin family had been on the side of the king of Shu for a long time. Her current actions were likely to cause misunderstandings to imperial concubine Shui. Whether it is slander or not, the truth will be revealed after the palace guards investigate. Imperial concubine Shui's expression had returned to calmness, but everyone could hear the suppressed anger in her voice. She looked down at the broken bracelet on the ground. As the legitimate daughter of the Chui family and an imperial concubine in the palace, even though she had seen all kinds of treasures, the destruction of this jade bracelet still made her very sad. What's more, the woman was the wife of Earl Li of Chang'an. Naturally, she would not let it go so easily. The silver-haired woman turned her head and looked at Rui, asking, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Rui smiled and said, "Thank you for just now." Imperial concubine Shui leaned over and said, "Why is the bracelet here? Did someone deliberately frame you?" Rui looked at the maid who was covering her face. The maid's eyes were slightly averted. The sound of orderly footsteps came from outside the door. A group of imperial guards walked in quickly from outside. The leader of the imperial guards walked straight to imperial concubine Shui and said respectfully, "Greetings, imperial concubine." Imperial concubine Shui said coldly, "Investigate carefully. I don't want to wrongly accuse anyone. You must find out who did it." "Yes." The leader of the imperial guards bowed and answered. I was just running over there and accidentally bumped into Madame Li. The bracelet fell out of her sleeve and broke." The maid recounted what had happened in front of the leader of the imperial guards. The imperial guards did not expect things to turn out like this. When someone passed the message just now, they just said that imperial concubine Shui lost the bracelet and no one went out of the hall. As long as the palace maids or the harem maids searched everyone, it would be easy to find out who took imperial concubine Shui's bracelet. However, there was no need to investigate now. "Mrs. Li, is this true?" He looked at the woman standing there and asked. He was a little hesitant. Everyone had heard of the famous County Earl Li. He didn't even care about the king of Shu and was favored by his majesty. If this matter was not handled well, it would be a big deal. Rui pointed to the maid and said, "The bracelet fell out of her sleeve and fell to the ground." As soon as these words were spoken, there was silence in the hall. Even imperial concubine Shui had a stunned expression on her face. That maid was the personal maid of noble consort Shui. Could it be that this maid stole the bracelet and accidentally broke it, so she simply framed Madame Li? Or could it be that she was simply following someone's orders to frame him? The former was naturally impossible. How could a mere maidservant have such guts? Once she was found out, she would not be able to survive in the imperial harem. Imperial concubine Shui's face was cold and she said, "You mean that I deliberately framed you? It's obvious that you stole the bracelet. How dare you frame imperial concubine Shui?" A woman in a palace dress walked out from behind imperial concubine Shui, pointed at Rui, and said sternly, "It's obvious that you stole the bracelet. How dare you frame imperial concubine Shui?" A woman in palace attire walked out from behind imperial concubine Shui. She pointed at Rui and said sternly. Third Miss Chen walked in front of Rui, looked at the woman and said softly, "Princess Hui, this matter has not been decided yet. Please watch your words. Princess Hui, let's wait for the result of this matter before saying these words." A beautiful woman in a palace dress beside imperial concubine Shui also said. "Princess Hui, let's wait for the result of this matter before saying these words." A beautiful lady in palace attire beside noble consort Shui also said. Princess Hui's expression changed. Even concubine Yen stood out, so she couldn't say anything else. Although her sister was an imperial concubine, in the harem, other than the empress, His Majesty's most favored concubine was concubine Yen. If not for the Chui family, the title of imperial concubine would have fallen into someone else's hands at a young age. The guard leader hesitated for a moment and said, "Imperial concubine, I'm afraid this matter will have to be decided by His Majesty and Her Majesty the Empress. This matter involved Gui Fei Nyang and Li Xianbo's wife, so he couldn't make the decision. The empress was the master of the harem, so it was appropriate for her to deal with the womenfolk. Moreover, the empress and his majesty were in the palace on the side, so they could report in a moment. What happened? A voice rang out from behind. The dozen or so imperial guards consciously opened up a path. When they saw the two young men walking in from outside, many people in the hall revealed looks of surprise. Li Xianbua. The guard leader walked over and immediately said, "Greetings, Your Highness, greetings, Li Xianbua." Seeing that familiar face, Third Miss Chen's face showed a trace of a complicated expression. Rui stood where she was, while the imperial concubine walked in the direction of Li Xian. What happened? Li Yi looked at the guard leader and asked. Your Excellency Li, it's like this. The guard leader described what just happened to him. He is Li Xianbua. How did he get in? My wife did such a thing. I'm afraid Li Xianbua is going to lose face today. There was a burst of whispers in the hall, and many people pointed at them. Concubine Shui looked at Li Yi with an unfathomable expression. I see. After hearing the guard leader's words, Li Yi nodded and walked in front of the maid. The maid raised her head and avoided his eyes. She didn't dare to look at him. Slap. Li Yi slapped the maid's face, looked at her and asked coldly, Who gave you the courage? The strength of this slap was much greater than the previous one. The maid stumbled and fell to the ground, a trace of blood flowing from the corner of her mouth. The slap was crisp, and then there was a long silence in the hall. Third Miss Chen's slap just now was because the maid was disrespectful to Countess Chen. Although her behavior was a bit extreme, even Concubine Shui couldn't say anything. But County Uncle Li slapped Concubine Shui fiercely in front of everyone. Didn't he look down on Concubine Shui? How dare you? How did you get in? After a long time, a sharp voice finally sounded. Concubine Hui pointed at Li Yi, and then pointed at the guards and said, Is this a place where anyone can come in? Take him down quickly. The secret bureau is ordered by His Majesty to maintain the security of Hibiscus Garden tonight. Concubine Shui lost her bracelet, so we have to investigate it carefully. Li Yi took out a plate and looked at the woman in the court dress and asked, Auntie, may I ask who you are? Auntie, Auntie. The woman in the court dress opened her mouth and blushed. Pfft, several young women in the back couldn't help but cover their mouths and laugh. Don't be rude. Third Miss Chen stepped forward and looked at him, saying, This is Concubine Hui. So this is Concubine Hui. My apologies, my apologies. Li Yi glanced at the woman and then cupped his hands to Concubine Shui, saying, Concubine Shui, don't worry. The secret bureau will definitely investigate this case clearly. Concubine Shui glanced at him and asked, Oh, how are you going to investigate? Li Yi pointed at the maid and said, This bold bee *tch dared to steal Concubine Shui's bracelet and put the blame on others. Concubine Shui, don't worry. Even if she doesn't confess now, she will confess everything when she arrives at the secret bureau. Many people in the hall were stunned by his words. Li Xianbo was really unreasonable. He made a conclusion without even investigating. Whether the maid did it or not, when she arrived at the secret bureau, it was not up to her whether she confessed or not. Wasn't it too obvious that he was protecting Madame? It was said that Li Xianbo was arrogant because of the favor. Now, he even looked down on Concubine Shui. Chapter 592. How dare you? Princess Hui's face turned red. She pointed at Li Yi and said, How dare you twist right and wrong at will? This matter should be reported to His Majesty and let His Majesty decide. Li Yi waved his hand and said, His Majesty is unwell and has already gone back to rest. The Secret Intelligence Office can handle such a small matter. I won't disturb His Majesty. Princess Hui snorted coldly and said, Then keep him temporarily and wait for His Majesty's decision. Concubine Shui glanced at Princess Hui thoughtfully. His Majesty and Her Majesty have arrived. At this moment, a eunuch's sharp and thin voice came from outside the door. Greetings to His Majesty and Her Majesty. A group of women's voices suddenly sounded in the hall. Their voices were clear and melodious. Emperor Jing slowly walked in from outside the door with Her Majesty beside him and Princess Royal on the other side. When he walked into the hall and saw Li Yi and Li Xian, he was slightly stunned and asked, "Why are you two here?" Then he saw the Imperial Guards in the hall and asked again, "What happened here?" The leader of the Imperial Guards immediately stepped forward and said respectfully, "Your Majesty, just now, Her Majesty walked aside and talked to Prince Consort." Mingzu came over and looked at Li Yi. She lowered her voice and asked, "Did you cause trouble again?" Li Yi glanced at her. Did he look like a troublemaker? It was always trouble that provoked him. After hearing the words of the leader of the Imperial Guards, Emperor Jing's face darkened slightly. He looked back at Changde, who shook his head and said, "Impossible. How could a Grandmaster realm expert be knocked into by a maid and have something fall out of his sleeve? Even if it really fell out, it could be retrieved before the other party could react. There was no need to even think about it." The problem lay with the maid. In the eyes of all the women in the hall, His Majesty was the most impartial and selfless. No matter if County Earl Li's wife really stole or if the palace maid framed her, everything would come to light after His Majesty showed up. Under their gazes, the fair and impartial His Majesty walked in front of the maidservant and asked lightly, "Who ordered you to do this?" Princess Consort Hui's expression froze. Noble Consort Chui glanced at Emperor Jing, and the rest of the women also looked incredulous. Your Majesty." The maid's entire body was trembling, and even her voice was trembling. "I will ask you again. Who ordered you to do this?" The maid's face was ashen, and her whole body was shaking like a sieve. "Drag him out. Flog him 50 times before questioning him," Emperor Jing said faintly. The leader of the Imperial Guards obeyed the order and 2 Imperial Guards carried the maid out. Not long after, a miserable scream came from outside. "Your Majesty, this..." Imperial concubine Chui walked out and pointed outside. She wanted to say something but hesitated. "I know what to do," Emperor Jing said. He glanced at Li Yi and Li Xian and said, "What are you two still doing here? Do you want me to add 2 more seats for you?" Li Yi and Li Xian were driven out by the old emperor before he could say a few words with Rui. He wanted to see what his concubines looked like, but he only saw Imperial concubine Chui. Although she was still charming, her mind was extremely vicious. This matter was most likely ordered by her. Imperial concubine Chui, right? The Chui family, right? These days, he was a little itchy. There was still half a month before the enrollment of the Imperial College. He had plenty of time. Inside the palace, the Princess Royal Highness was surrounded by many women. Rui and the 3rd Miss of the Qin family were talking. The Empress was holding the Crown Princess's hand. No one knew what topic they were talking about, but it made her blush. Imperial concubine Chui sat next to Emperor Jing. She bowed and said, "It's all my fault. I almost ruined my sister's banquet." Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, "In the future, you have to take good care of the servants around you. Some people are becoming more and more bold." Another concubine next to him nodded and said, "I should take good care of the servants in the palace. Recently, a lot of the knight Mingzu that your Majesty rewarded have gone missing. Jewelry has also been inexplicably lost. The servants by this concubine's side are rather clean." Imperial concubine Yen smiled. Only her palace had never lost anything. Shaning, that girl, always gave her some knight Mingzu or other jewelry. When the girl grew up, she knew how to be filial to her mother. However, a daughter was a daughter after all. She couldn't compare to Imperial concubine Chen, who gave birth to a good son. Prince Jean was young and intelligent. It was said that County Earl Li asked His Majesty to let Prince Jean be a teacher of the Imperial College. There were even rumors that County Earl Li, who was highly regarded by His Majesty, wanted to support Prince Jean as the emperor. Of course, these things had nothing to do with her. In a few years, her daughter would have a good husband. That was what she was concerned about. Not long after, the leader of the imperial guards came in from outside the hall and said, "Your Majesty," she confessed. The maid confessed very quickly. If there was no special favor other than the word punishment by flogging, then this punishment by flogging was the standard punishment by flogging. 50 flogging was enough to beat an adult man half to death. As for those who were slightly weaker, they might not even be able to keep their lives. At the 10th flogging, she couldn't help but confess. The leader of the imperial guard said, she admitted that she was greedy for the imperial concubine's bracelet. Originally, she planned to find a place to hide outside the hall, but she accidentally bumped into Lady Li, so she simply pushed all the blame onto Lady Li, this lowly maid. Imperial concubine Shui showed a trace of anger on her face. She waved her hand and said, "How dare she do such a bold thing? Someone, drag her away and flog her to death." Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, "Today is the Lantern Festival. It's not appropriate to kill anyone. Flog her 100 times. If she is still alive, expel her from the palace." "Yes, Your Majesty." After the leader of the imperial guards responded, he quickly walked out. His Majesty said that today was the Lantern Festival and it was not appropriate to kill anyone. Thus, he couldn't really flog her to death. Although she could avoid the death penalty, she couldn't escape punishment. She stole the imperial concubine's treasures and framed the county earl's wife. After this 100 flogging, she would most likely lose half of her life. She could only spend the rest of her life in bed. This lowly maid, how dare she? I was almost deceived by her just now. Yes, Madame Li seems to be a good person. She wouldn't do such a thing. The maids couldn't help but sigh in their hearts. His Majesty was really wise. With just a glance, he knew that it was the maid who framed Madame Li. And the county earl Li, who was in the limelight, had more than just the emperor's favor. After all, if he was seriously investigated, he was disrespectful to the imperial concubine and defended Madame Li. However, how could a little maid dare to do such a bold thing? Moreover, she was the personal maid of imperial concubine Shui. It was unknown whether there was any hidden story behind this matter. "Your Majesty, I'm not feeling well. I'll leave first." Imperial concubine Shui stretched out her hand to support her forehead. There was a trace of tiredness in her voice. Emperor Jing looked at her and said, "Do you want to summon an imperial doctor?" "No, I just feel a little tired. I'll be fine after a short rest." Imperial concubine Shui shook her head slightly and said. Emperor Jing nodded. Imperial concubine Shui, followed by 2 maids, walked out of the hall. As soon as she stepped out of the hall, Princess Hui, who had a strong unwillingness on her face, also followed her out. There were many palaces in Hibiscus Garden. Important concubines such as the Empress, Imperial Concubine, and Concubine Yen all had their own palaces. At this time, in a palace somewhere, Imperial Concubine Shui stood with her back facing the hall. Her face was cold, and she didn't look tired at all. Princess Hui came in from outside and said with a little anger in her voice, "What's the background of Li Yi? Why does he deserve His Majesty's favoritism? He obviously didn't investigate it strictly. Qin might have confessed under torture." Slap. A loud slap suddenly came from the hall. Princess Hui covered her burning face, and her eyes were full of disbelief. "Sister, who allowed you to act on your own?" Imperial concubine Shui looked at her with cold eyes and said coldly. Chapter 593. Sister, Princess Hui covered one side of her face, and the other side was extremely pale. She looked away and said in a trembling voice. Imperial concubine Shui said coldly, "Qin grew up in the Shui family and has been with me for more than 10 years. Before that, she took care of your daily life. Who else can order her around except you?" Princess Hui lowered her head and said nothing for a long time. After a while, she suddenly gritted her teeth and a strong hatred appeared on her pale face. She said harshly, "Yes, it's me. I asked Qin her to do this. A jade bracelet is nothing. I just want to ruin her reputation. This is just the beginning. They ruined my child. I want them to die a horrible death. What happened to Lida? Imperial concubine Shui frowned and asked. After Do was flogged, he can no longer have sex. Princess Hui squeezed out a few words from between her teeth. Imperial concubine Shui frowned even more. After a while, she said in a low voice, "Stupid." The king of Shu was expelled from the capital city because of the last incident. He was not summoned to the imperial court this time. Their power in the court was also severely damaged. The Qin family's attitude was unclear, and Prime Minister Qin's party also began to waver. The influence on other officials was deeper. The Chui family and her plot for more than 10 years was almost destroyed. It was impossible for them to recover in a short time. What they could do now was to bear it. Even if their power in the court was severely damaged, they still had no rivals. The Chui family had an extremely strong foundation in the aristocrats, the court, and the people. No one, including the emperor, dared to underestimate them. It was simply a fool's dream for other princes to want to touch the East Palace. If they could maintain the original situation, they would win. But if they continued like before, they would be pushed into the abyss step by step. Imperial concubine Shui looked at her and said coldly, "This matter will come to an end. 1 year, at most 1 year. No matter who Li Yi is, you can do whatever you want to him. If he does such a stupid thing again and spoils my son's plan, don't blame me for being ruthless." When he said the last sentence, his tone was extremely harsh. "I got it." Princess Hui nodded, gritted her teeth and said, but the hatred in her eyes was still so strong that it could not be dispersed. "Royal Prince Duanyang can no longer have sex." Li Yi was very shocked when he heard the news from Li Xian. Wasn't it supposed to be a wooden board? He was going to be beaten on his stomach, not lying down. How could he be injured? Where was he injured? Could it be that the blood capillaries were clogged due to fear, causing the blood vessels to be blocked and the peripheral nerves to die off, causing the cavernous body to die off? It's already spread among the nobles in the capital. Don't you know? Li Xian looked at him and asked. Li Yi shook his head. He had never known what the circle of the rich and powerful in the capital was like. Moreover, he had been staying at home to look after the child or accompany Rui for the past few months. He had no time to care about other people's business. It's said that Prince Hui and Princess Consort Hui invited many skilled doctors, and even a few imperial physicians, but none of them were able to cure Royal Prince Duanyang. Li Xian sighed. For a man, this was already the greatest shame of his life. So pitiful. Although he couldn't empathize with them, they were both men. Even if Royal Prince Duanyang was a good-for-nothing, he was still pitiful in this matter. Li Yi also sighed and said, "Yeah, everything is fine now. It's all because of God's sin." Li Xian turned to look at him with a helpless expression on his face. "Don't you know who the culprit is?" Thinking of something, Li Yi looked at Li Xian and asked, "By the way, is that auntie just now Princess Consort Hui?" Li Xian nodded and said, "Yes, she is Princess Consort Hui, Royal Consort Chui's twin sister and Royal Prince Duanyang's mother. 2 sisters, one is a royal consort and the other is a princess." "Is the Chui family really so powerful?" Li Yi asked again. Li Xian nodded and said, "In the entire Jing kingdom, the Chui family is considered one of the most influential families. It has been around for at least hundreds of years, and its influence is even greater. Except for the royal family, there are only a few families that can compete with the Chui family." Li Yi had learned about these families and the royal family before, but he didn't know as much as Li Xian did. More than 100 years ago, the aristocratic families were so powerful that even the royal family had to give way to them. Although they were not as prosperous as they were at that time, their foundation was still there. Without a proper reason, even the royal family couldn't afford to offend them. Of course, this didn't mean that the royal family couldn't touch them. It was just that those aristocratic families were too deeply rooted and had a great influence in the court and among the people. Even if the current emperor had always wanted to weaken the power of the aristocratic families, he had to take into account the stability of the people and couldn't take tough measures. Moreover, the relationship between aristocratic families and the royal family was also very complicated. There were many concubines in the palace, and almost every one of them had a certain power behind them. Royal consort Chui represented the Chui family. Even the empress had a powerful family behind her that was not weaker than the Chui family. Concubine Yan, concubine Qin, the concubines of various kings, and even Li Xian's own concubines. The entanglement of interests in this was not something that could be explained in a few simple words. The more he said, the more confused Li Yi felt. He shook his head and asked again, the Chui family almost monopolized the jewelry business, so they must be very profitable. Compared with your father-in-law's family, which family is richer? In the entire Jing kingdom, except for the royal family, no family is richer than the Wang family. However, for ordinary people, the wealth of the Chui family is still unimaginable. Li Yi nodded and said, then let's do it. What for? Li Xian raised his head and asked curiously. Cheers. Li Yi raised the teacup in his hand and said. In the Jade Palace, an imperial guard soon brought the news that the bracelet was stolen by the maid of royal consort Chui. After the matter was exposed, she deliberately framed Countess Li and was severely punished by His Majesty. She was flogged 100 times. Her life was spared, but her ending was still miserable. Li Yi was not surprised at all. Just now, Princess Hui had been trying to expose the matter to the old emperor, but she did not know that it was simply courting death. It was not good to frame anyone, but to frame Rui. He wanted to ask Chang whether he had the ability to do so. The old emperor was suffering from asthma, not senile dementia. He was the one who had gotten himself into this mess. However, this piece of news was rather thought-provoking to others. A little maid stole the treasure of the royal consort and framed Countess Li. She must have eaten a bear's heart and a leopard's heart to dare to do so. The king of Shu had once offended Countess Li and was almost beaten to death in front of hundreds of officials. But now, he could still live freely in Hibiscus Garden. Where was the king of Shu? The eldest son of the emperor, the prince most likely to enter the East Palace, was now banished to Shuzhou to herd sheep. The officials of the king of Shu's faction avoided him as if he was the plague. How could they provoke him at such a critical moment? Could it be that royal consort Chui was really out of her mind? Everyone could clearly see the current situation in the imperial court. The college was about to open, and Countess Li was highly valued by His Majesty. He was in high spirits and no one in the imperial court could steal his edge. The king of Shu's faction had just suffered a heavy blow. Now it was best to keep a low profile and wait for the right time. It was really stupid to provoke the other party at such a critical moment. Chapter 594. The lights in Hibiscus Garden were still the same, and the lake was full of lanterns. As the breeze blew, the water sparkled and crushed the shadows of the lanterns in the lake. What happened in Ingsue Garden was just a small interlude. Less than an hour later, people came out of the hall one after another. The officials and nobles found their families, either strolling in the garden at night or accompanying them home. As they walked along the corridor on the water, the Shitsi face said to Rui, Lu Jiejia, if you run into my husband later, please tell him that I will stay behind to accompany the Empress tonight. He can go back by himself. Rui nodded. The crown princess smiled and turned to walk back into the hall. He usually stays at home and likes to cook. He likes to make some strange things. Rui and third Miss Chen walked side by side and said something with a smile. The two of them are very different. Third Miss Chen shook her head and said softly. Rui naturally knew who the two people she was talking about were, but she didn't want to continue this topic. Hey, isn't this third Miss Chen? A strange voice suddenly came from the front. Princess Hui, who had just left the hall, suddenly appeared there. She looked a little strange. She looked at third Miss Chen and said, I heard that Li family's Li Minghan came back some time ago. You didn't wait in vain for the past 20 years. Hearing this, Third Miss Chen's body trembled. She clenched her fists in her sleeves and her face turned slightly pale. Many women who passed by on the corridor paused and frowned slightly when they heard this. Third Miss Chen was a sentimental person. Her matter was not a secret in the circle of the nobles in the capital city. Everyone knew that her hair turned white overnight because of Li Minghan. If they talked to her on normal days, they would avoid talking about that topic. What Princess Hui said just now was indeed a little too much. It was impossible that she didn't know that Li Minghan had passed away. At this moment, she said these words on purpose to make Third Miss Chen sad. However, Chen family, Cui family, and Hui Wang, weren't they always on the same boat? Princess Hui smiled and said, "Oh, I forgot. Li Minghan died a long time ago. It's good that he died. What's the point of living in this world for such a heartless person? But I seem to have heard that Li Minghan's son looks exactly like him. As the saying goes, the son pays his father's debts." Shut up. A light reprimand suddenly sounded. Princess Hui was slightly startled. When she looked at the woman beside Third Miss Chen, the anger that she had suppressed with great difficulty rose again. She said angrily, "How dare you? Who are you?" She had wanted to use her status to pressure her, but when she saw the woman's eyes, she felt her tongue stiffen, and she couldn't say what she wanted to say. Apart from that, there seemed to be something pressing down on her, causing her breathing to stagnate. Even opening her mouth became extremely difficult. "Let's go." Ru-yi smiled and turned to speak to Third Miss Chen. She took a step forward, but Princess Consort Hui staggered a few steps back and bumped into the railing of the corridor. The maid beside her didn't have time to help her and saw Princess Consort Hui fall down head first. Although it was not the center of the lake, the water was not shallow. Princess Hui flopped a few times on the water, and then there was no sound. The maid was so scared that her soul almost left her body. She screamed, "Help! Help! Help! Princess has fallen into the water." Not far away, a group of imperial guards rushed over. When they came to the front, they immediately jumped down without hesitation. Princess Hui was soon rescued, but she fainted because of excessive shock. Seeing this scene, the woman was frightened. Recalling the scene just now, she couldn't come to her senses for a long time. Madame Li clearly didn't do anything. She just took a step forward, and Princess Hui stepped back several steps until she fell into the lake. Why did this scene look so familiar? After a while, they remembered that King of Shu was so scared by County Uncle Li's murderous eyes that he jumped into the lake. When they looked at Mrs. Li again, they couldn't help but be frightened. When they walked forward again, the crowd retreated. Third Miss Chen didn't say anything along the way. After walking out of the long corridor on the lake, Li Yi and Li Xian were waiting not far away. "You go first. I'll wait for them," Third Miss Chen said and stood there waiting for the woman of the Chen family. Ru-yi glanced ahead and didn't say anything. After saying goodbye to her, she walked straight ahead. "Did concubine Shui do anything to you just now?" Li Yi asked Rui in the carriage after leaving Furong Garden. Rui shook her head and said, "What could she do to me?" She helped Li Yi adjust his collar and said with a smile, "My husband, you forgot that I'm very powerful." "No, I still can't take this lying down." Although what happened tonight didn't affect Rui much, courtesy demanded reciprocity since ancient times was a traditional virtue. Traditional virtues couldn't be lost. How could one only accept gifts and not give them? "I'm fine. My husband, don't act recklessly." Rui looked at him and said in a low voice. Li Yi shook his head and said, "As a county uncle, of course, I have to set an example and abide by the law. How can I act recklessly?" After a quarter of an hour, the carriage couldn't go any further. Tonight, several main streets in the capital were full of traffic. It was difficult for carriages and horses to move. Li Yi and Rui got out of the carriage. In the sky behind them, fireworks rose and exploded. The first night of the Lantern Festival had passed. According to the situation in previous years, the residual heat of the Lantern Festival would probably last for 2 or 3 days. After the Lantern Festival, the New Year's festival was finally over. For the ordinary people in the capital, life returned to peace and it was time for another busy year. However, for the officials in the imperial court, the word peace had nothing to do with them. No matter when, there were countless undercurrents surging in the imperial court. A little carelessness would cause one to be involved and be doomed eternally. Last night in the hibiscus garden, the wife of County Uncle Li was framed by the personal maid of concubine Shui. This was one of the undercurrents, which was regarded by everyone as some kind of action of concubine Shui. After all, everyone knew that County Uncle Li and the King of Shu were completely on the opposite side. The more he was valued by the emperor, the worse it was for the King of Shu. In front of so many people, Princess Hui was surprised by Third Miss Chen's sarcastic remarks, which made many people puzzled. The Chen family was the closest ally of the King of Shu and was also on the same path as Prince Hui. If the two families hadn't fallen out, how could Princess Hui say such words in public? They didn't know when it started, but they gradually began to understand these things. But there was one thing that everyone was very clear about. That was, the faction of the King of Shu, which was once powerful enough to control the imperial court, seemed to be gradually declining. Early in the morning, at the gate of the Chen family, a young man came forward and handed over an invitation, saying, "Please send a message that Prince Duanyang is here to visit old Marquis Chen." The gatekeeper of the Chen family looked at the young man a few more times and thought, why did Prince Duanyang come at this moment? The second master is angry and probably won't be nice to him. However, Prince Duanyang was different from others. No matter what, he had to bring him in first. The servant of the Chen family invited Prince Duanyang in, and a middle-aged man came out. "Who is this?" Chen Chang's expression was somewhat ugly as he asked coldly. The servant hurriedly said, "Second master, this is Prince Duanyang." His mother was reprimanded by concubine Shui last night and ordered him to come to the Chen family's mansion early this morning to admit his mistake. Knowing that the person in front of him was the second master of the Chen family, Prince Duanyang immediately cupped his hands and said, "I am Lida." Before he could finish his words, he felt a sharp pain in his chest and was kicked out of the door. Prince Duanyang covered his chest with his face twisted in pain. He raised his head and looked at the middle-aged man in front of him with a look of disbelief. "Get lost." Chen Chang's face was gloomy and his eyes flashed with killing intent. He spat out a word coldly. Chapter 595. In the hibiscus garden on the night of the Upper Lantern Festival, Consort Hui reopened the scar in Third Miss Chen's heart in front of many people. The next day, Second Master Chen broke two of Prince Duanyang's ribs with a kick. The two most reliable allies of the King of Shu turned against each other. Countless people sighed in their hearts. They were getting more and more confused by the world. The Chen and Shui families were almost on the same side. Prince Hui and Shui were also on the same side. In this way, the Chen and Prince Hui could only wear the same pair of pants. The relationship between the two families was known by all the officials and nobles in the capital city. But why did the two families stab each other in the back recently? No one knew what happened to Prince Duanyang after his two ribs were broken. It was Consort Shui who would have a headache because of this. Consort Shui must have had a lot of headaches these days. Li Yi had not left his house for 2 days. The academy was about to open and the old emperor placed great importance on it. No matter what, he had to pretend that he was seriously preparing for it and that he would not hesitate to risk his life for the good of the country. Moreover, he didn't go out for 2 days because he was doing something more important. But now, he was leaning against the door and watching the show. Fong was driven out of the house by his wife with a broom. His wife put her hands on her waist and scolded him for being a wastrel. The cause of this incident was when old Fong went to fight for the hero ranking. In the end, he could not control his strength and ended up seriously injuring the elite ranked on the heaven ranking list whom he challenged. He had to pay dozens of taels of silver for his medical expenses, and old Fong's wife was worried about the money. Hence, this scene happened. "Wastrel, don't come back to sleep tonight." His wife scolded angrily and went home. Fong walked over dejectedly and squatted down beside Li Yi with a depressed face. Li Yi looked down at him and said, "Don't pretend. Don't go back to sleep tonight. You want it to be like this, don't you?" Lao Feng raised his head and said righteously, "Young master, what you said is wrong. When have I ever slept in the jadeite courtyard at night? Here comes work." Li Yi glanced at him and walked into the mansion. "There's a job." Feng stood up abruptly with an excited look on his face. He immediately chased after the man. Less than an hour later, he walked out with half a green cucumber in his hand. He took a bite of it and muttered to himself in a low voice. "What are you doing with these things? Burning bricks? I don't think there are any plans to build any houses." He looked up and saw his wife standing at the door. She looked at him coldly and said, "What are you waiting for? Come back." "I'm coming." Feng sighed, and a disappointed expression appeared on his face. He shook his head, put the booklet in his bosom, and walked back with his head lowered. Back then, the Math Academy had enrolled a total of 100 students. Now, the total number of students was about 120. Getting in through the back door was common everywhere. Since the old emperor couldn't reject them, Li Yi couldn't just shut them out. There were still a few people who were forced into the academy like the little bastard. Fortunately, there were not many of them, and it was within the range that Li Yi could accept. Otherwise, if someone voluntarily dropped out, it would be hard for him to explain to the old emperor. The class schedule of the Math Academy was very scientific. There were 5 days in class and 2 days off, and 1 month in the winter and summer vacations. Classes were held from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m., and from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. There were also breaks between classes. There were no self-study sessions at night. It was very humane. Learning mathematics for 8 hours a day was actually very painful. However, it was a piece of cake for the students who could read the 4 books and 5 classics for a lifetime. This kind of high-intensity knowledge instilling could cultivate a batch of useful mathematics talents for the Jing Kingdom in a short period of time. Whether it was the schedule, the content of the classes, or even the timetable, they were all very scientific. The doctoral students from the Math Academy agreed with this. The Math Academy had been separated from the Math Academy. Currently, the doctoral students from the Math Academy were temporarily under Li Yi's command. They were the first to come into contact with the new mathematics, so their starting point was much higher than the students from the Math Academy. As teaching assistants, they would listen to the lectures and assist the doctoral students in teaching. A doctoral student from the Math Academy held the timetable in his hand. He looked up at Li Yi and asked curiously, "Sir Dean, aren't you going to teach the students?" There was something wrong with the timetable in his hand. Why wasn't the most important dean's name on it? Li Yi glanced at him and said, "The dean's responsibility is to provide strategic support for the mathematics school and the general direction and to oversee the overall situation. If he has to do something as trivial as teaching, then what's the point of having teachers like you?" Another doctoral student next to him glared at the fellow who had just spoken and said with a smile, "Sir Dean, you're right. We'll definitely remember your teachings in the future and live up to His Majesty's expectations. We'll cultivate top-notch mathematics talents for the Jing Kingdom." In the end, there were still subordinates who could understand his good intentions. Li Yi nodded and said, "His Majesty isn't here yet. I'll go in and take a nap. Wake me up when His Majesty arrives." The old emperor attached great importance to the Math Academy because it could save him a lot of money. Therefore, on the 2nd day of the 2nd month, which was the opening day of the academy, even though he was ill, he would still bring a few important officials from the imperial court to cut the ribbon and preside over the opening ceremony. At the same time, he would encourage the students so that they would establish a correct outlook on life and study for the rise of the Jing Kingdom. As the dean of the Math Academy, he naturally had a special place. For example, he could have a huge office all by himself. The bed was also very big, so he could sleep, or use it to oversee the overall situation. It was perfect for providing strategic support for the Math Academy. The old emperor came very quickly. Li Yi was woken up not long after he slept. This time, the lineup of leaders for the inspection was very powerful. Prime Minister Qin did not come, but Prime Minister Shen followed the old emperor. The leaders of the 6 ministries came in person, which gave the Math Academy a lot of face. In the sports field behind the academy, Jing Di stood on the rostrum and waved to the students below. He said, "You are all the future pillars of the Jing kingdom. You may rise." There were many people on the rostrum, including Li Yi. However, when the old emperor was standing, no one dared to sit down. After he finished speaking, Prime Minister Shen went up to speak again. Minister Qin Huan, the Minister of Revenue, rambled on for another half an hour. Li Yi hated this kind of superficial work the most. However, this was the system. He could not do anything about it. He listened until he was drowsy. Naturally, the students of the Math Academy were not drowsy. On the contrary, they could not suppress the excitement in their hearts when they were able to see the emperor and many important officials in the court. Not only that, His Majesty also promised that as long as they could successfully graduate from the Math Academy, they would immediately be able to get a position. What was the purpose of studying hard for more than 10 years? Wasn't it to one day win an official position and bring glory to their family? Taking bribes, bending the law, committing crimes, to repay His Majesty's appreciation of them. The children of the officials did not have much of an opinion about this. After all, they came here to gild their gold. With this qualification, they would be able to rise rapidly in the future and have a carefree future. For the children of poor families, this was the greatest preferential treatment that the emperor had given them. In the crowd below, a 15 or 16-year-old boy secretly raised his head. When he saw a young man on the stage, his face suddenly showed a bitter expression. Chapter 596. Wang Dan, what's wrong? A boy of the same age beside him noticed his abnormality and asked with some doubts. No, nothing. Wang Dan shook his head and said silently in his heart, can't see me, can't see me. A trace of doubt appeared on the face of the boy beside him. When he looked at the stage again, the doubt turned into impatience. He had been talking for more than an hour. This Minister of Revenue was talking too much nonsense. The Minister of Revenue, Qin Huan, was a man of few words. Why was he so talkative at this moment? Li Yi didn't know how long he had been listening to Qin Huan. Just as he was about to fall asleep standing up, a doctor beside him nudged him. County Uncle Li, His Majesty is calling you. Li Yi raised his head and rubbed his eyes. He heard Emperor Jing's voice. He turned his head and Emperor Jing was looking at him. As the Dean of the School of Mathematics, what else do you have to say to the students of the School of Mathematics? Watching the young Dean walk to the front, more than half of the people immediately showed deep gratitude on their faces. It was the Dean's credit that the students from poor families could have such an opportunity. For the sake of the students from poor families, he did not hesitate to offend the nobles in the capital. He just wanted to fight for more places for the students from poor families. In the imperial court, who was willing to do this for the students from poor families? Of course, a few people in the crowd did not look good. For example, Chen Mao, Qin Mao, and Shui Mao looked slightly gloomy. The humiliation on that day had almost made them a joke in the capital. It was not something that could be forgotten in a few months. Li Yi looked down and stretched out his hand to press down. The noise below immediately disappeared. Is everyone here? He turned around and asked one of the mathematics professors. The doctor of mathematics immediately said, in reply to the dean, the 120 students of the School of Mathematics are all here. Since everyone is here, let's take the exam. Li Yi looked at the students below and said, after an hour, gather in the classroom for the entrance exam of the School of Mathematics. Those who do not pass the exam will be disqualified. As the dean, he had nothing to give them, so he would take the exam as a greeting gift. He had thought that the young dean would give a long speech like the others before him, but he had never expected that he would only say 2 short sentences. Before the students could rejoice in their hearts, it immediately turned into astonishment and shock. Those who don't pass the entrance exam will be disqualified. It wasn't easy for him to get into the Arithmetic Academy and enjoy the country's special allowance. After graduation, he was given the treatment of a civil servant. If he were to be expelled from the arithmetic academy, losing face would be a small matter. But his dream of becoming an official would be shattered. After a short moment of silence, a huge uproar came from below. Jing Di looked at Li Yi with a puzzled expression, obviously waiting for his explanation. Your Majesty, you don't know. Li Yi walked over, looked at Jing Di and said, as early as 3 months ago, the School of Mathematics has already distributed the textbooks they will use for admission. If they are diligent, 3 months is enough to read all the contents of the textbooks. The content involved in this exam can all be found in the textbooks. If in this case, there are still people who do not reach the passing line, it means that they are just lazy people who are destined to not have great achievements. Even if they really enter the court in the future, it will not be a blessing for the court. Li Yi said righteously, the School of Mathematics is indebted to Your Majesty, so we have to be responsible to Your Majesty and the court. If there are not enough students, we can recruit more, but we must not waste time on these people. Jing Di pondered for a moment and nodded slightly. What you said is reasonable. In this case, I will stay here for a while and see what will happen. Ah. Your Majesty, you want to stay here? Li Yi was stunned. Jing Di looked at him and asked, why? Is there a problem? If the old emperor wanted to stay here, he could not take special care of those difficult candidates. Plan A was temporarily cancelled, and the implementation of Plan B was postponed. No, no. Li Yi shook his head and sighed in his heart. You are so busy with official business, but you still want to waste time here. Don't you know how many memorials you have to read today? The candidates below had already realized that this exam could not be avoided, so they hurriedly walked in the direction of the school's dormitory. There was still an hour before the exam began. They would remember as much as they could. Father. After the students dispersed, Monarch Jean came from the side and walked in front of Jing Di. He looked up and said. Jing Di smiled and touched his head. He said, Han, have you thought about it? Do you really want to be a teacher in this school of mathematics? I have thought about it. Monarch Jean nodded and said, I have grown up. I want to share the burden of father. Jing Di smiled, and his face showed a deep sense of relief. The playful boy had finally grown up. He thought of the street with all kinds of delicious food and strange things next to the School of Mathematics. From now on, he did not need to stay in the palace every day. He could go fishing by the river and chase rabbits in the mountains. Li Han's expression became more determined. Father, rest assured. I will be a dutiful teacher. 120 students were divided into 4 exam rooms. Each exam room was supervised by 2 doctors. There were also palace guards at the door and outside the window. Their eyes were like knives, and they patrolled the exam room to prevent anyone from cheating. In the exam room, some people were smiling and high-spirited, while others were sad and dejected. Outside the exam room, Li Yi was showing Jing Di and the others around the School of Mathematics. This place was different from the ordinary academies in the Jing Kingdom. The classrooms, playground, dormitory, and canteen were all designed by Li Yi himself. The layout was very aesthetic. The green plants on both sides of the road were sprouting, and it was very comfortable to step on the lawn in the middle of the playground. Not bad. Jing Di seemed to have a good impression of this place, and he nodded with satisfaction. In fact, it is still not enough. Li Yi regretfully pointed to the open space not far behind and said, if we can dig an artificial lake in that place, it would be better. The students can walk by the lake, read, and sleep by the lake. It is also comfortable. But the funds are not enough. We still need tens of thousands of taels of silver. Can Your Majesty, ahem. Jing Di coughed and said, there is no need for an artificial lake. This year, the national treasury is tight, and we need to save unnecessary expenses. Why was it unnecessary? In the summer evening, if the rocking chair was moved to the lake under the tree, the breeze would blow from the lake, and the cicadas would sing. If one was in the mood, they could fish and have a barbecue at night. What a beautiful picture it would be. They could not only think of letting the School of Mathematics export talents for the country. The necessary humanistic care was also indispensable. The old emperor was too poor now. They had to find a way for him to earn some money. When the national treasury was a little full, he would be embarrassed to not pay for the School of Mathematics to dig the lake. Ding! The ringing of the bell meant that the exam was over. All the students walked out of the exam room. Some looked up at the sky, and some looked down at the ground. They did not expect to encounter such a thing on the first day of school. They were really not mentally prepared. For some of them, today was the day they entered the school, and also the day they were kicked out of the School of Mathematics. It was a half-day tour of the school, and they could also pay homage to the emperor and the ministers in the court. It seemed that it was not a loss. Chapter 597. All the test papers were copied and printed a few days ago. Originally, they planned to set aside half a day to mark the papers and wait until tomorrow morning to post the results. However, today the old emperor was in a good mood and the results would be marked and summarized immediately. Including Li Yi, the Imperial College's mathematics doctors, mathematics students, and even Prince Jin's little fatty personally marked the papers. It only took a while for all 120 papers to be read. How is it? Emperor Jing came over and looked at Li Yi and asked. Li Yi held a list in his hand and said, out of the 120 students, 21 are unqualified. Emperor Jing took the list and glanced at it. He frowned and said, all of them are from aristocratic families? Yes. Li Yi nodded and said, in today's exam, there were many students from poor families who got full marks. There was no one who failed. Emperor Jing had been deliberately supporting the children of poor families over the years. He knew that they often worked harder than the children of aristocratic families because of their family circumstances. Although they lacked resources, they frequently performed well in the imperial examinations with their hard work. On the other hand, among the children of the aristocratic families, extravagant and lascivious were prevalent. There were many vermin and they were useless. However, the last time the Calculation Academy enrolled students, it was already biased towards the poor. If these 20 people were expelled, there would be many objections in the court. Moreover, among these people, there was the boy from the Wang family and the nephew of concubine Yan. He had promised them not long ago. If he expelled them on the first day of school, he, as the emperor, would lose face. However, in front of so many people, he had already agreed to Li Yi's request. The emperor had to keep his word, so he couldn't take it back at this moment. Everyone makes mistakes. Your Majesty, in my opinion, why don't you give them another chance and let them study in the arithmetic college for 3 months? If they are still so lazy after 3 months, they will be kicked out and will never be hired again. Li Yi thought for a moment and looked at Emperor Jing. During the Spring Festival, he visited many of the Li family's relatives. Among the 21 people, he had met several of them. If he was so heartless, it would be hard for him to meet them in the future. As for the little bastard of the Wang family, the business between the two families had just started, so it was not good for him to disrespect the Wang family. In addition, the boy's surname Jing seemed to have some relationship with concubine Yan. He was a proud girl, so it was not good for him to disrespect the Wang family. Of course, he couldn't purposely keep this bunch of disappointing fellows, or else he wouldn't be able to convince the masses. All students should be treated equally. After all, impartiality, fairness, and impartiality were his principles in doing things. It's good to know your mistakes and correct them. Emperor Jing looked at Li Yi with satisfaction, nodded and said, that's good. Give them a chance, lest they say that the college is not tolerant. But, Your Majesty, look, Qin Zhong and Chen Hao. Li Yi pointed at the names of the two people and said, they scored 100 points on the test paper, but they didn't even score 10 points. It's too unreasonable. Qin Zhong, the eldest son of the Qin family's third branch, and Chen Hao, a son of the Chen family's side branch. Emperor Jing glanced at them and said faintly, rotten wood cannot be carved. These two people should be expelled directly. Li Yi counted with his fingers. 13 minus 2, there were still more than a dozen. There was still more to come. There was no hurry, there was still a long way to go. However, he could only stop here for today. After all, he had to be fair and just. The results of the entrance examination were posted on a high wall in the arithmetic college. According to a doctor, this wall would be specially used to post examination results. Congratulations, Brother Wang, for getting full marks. Brother He, don't make fun of me. Aren't you the same? Sigh, it's a pity. Just 1 point. I clearly saw that question yesterday. The students gathered under the wall chatted and laughed. At this time, the results had been posted, and it was clear at a glance whether they passed or not. Most people breathed a sigh of relief, and because of the score, they began to compete with their friends. Of course, this wall was an honor roll for some people, but for others, it was a pillar of shame. Wang Dan stood in the corner, and his face was red. He was so embarrassed that he wished there was a hole on the ground to hide in. These few months, he only cared about playing and flipped a few pages of books at the beginning. 60 points was considered a pass, but he didn't even get half of it. He was afraid that he would be expelled today. He couldn't imagine what kind of reprimand and ridicule he would receive when he returned home. A 15 or 16-year-old youth beside him patted his shoulder and said, "Don't worry, my score is worse than yours. At most, I will be expelled. Who wants to stay in this crappy place? After we leave, we can do whatever we want. No one will care." Wang Dan nodded. If he was expelled, then so be it. At most, he would receive a small punishment and ridicule. In comparison, staying in the arithmetic college and having to face the person he had offended every day was even more terrifying. He even dared to beat up Brother Qin and the King of Shu, let alone himself. For the sake of his life, he had to stay far away from the arithmetic college. At this time, a doctor from the arithmetic college walked over and said, "Anyone who scored more than 60 points in the entrance examination will be considered a pass. Those who pass can leave." Instantly, most of the people started to disperse, but they didn't go too far. They just watched from afar. Those who stayed were naturally those who didn't reach the passing mark. No matter how thick-skinned the 21 of them were, they couldn't hide the shame in their hearts when they were being watched by more than 100 people. These people didn't just include their friends, but also the friends of their elders, the current court officials, the ministers of the 6 ministries, the prime minister, the emperor. Li Yi walked over from afar. These people all had their heads lowered, their faces full of shame. "I have good news for all of you." His gaze swept across the crowd and said, "Those who didn't reach the passing mark in the entrance examination originally didn't have the right to enter. However, His Majesty is benevolent and has decided to give all of you another chance. You can enter the college first. 3 months later, the college will conduct another examination for all of you. If you still don't pass by then, you can pack your things and leave." After hearing this, after a brief moment of shock, everyone was immediately overjoyed. They felt as though they had regained what they had lost. They were already prepared to be reprimanded by their elders when they returned, but they didn't expect to get another chance. 3 months was enough. 3 months was enough. After 3 months, they couldn't let such an embarrassing scene happen again. Among the crowd, the youth named Wang Dan heaved a sigh of relief. Although he didn't want to study mathematics here, he couldn't afford to be chased out on the first day. It's good to know your mistakes and correct them. I hope that you can remember today's lesson and study hard in the future to serve the country. You should know that failure isn't scary. Li Yi looked at them and said in a low voice. A look of shame appeared on the faces of the students, but it was soon followed by a look of gratitude. It turned out that the dean didn't want to chase them away. He wanted to use this opportunity to let them learn a lesson and let them understand that failure wasn't scary. Without failure, how could there be success? Jing Di nodded slightly, and the officials behind him also smiled. This young Dean Li did have some ability when it came to admonishing students. Failure isn't scary, Li Yi said in a low voice. The next moment, his voice suddenly became stern. What's scary is that you still believe this sentence. 3 months ago, the textbooks were already given to all of you. Even if you took an hour out every day, you would still be able to finish reading the contents of the books. You shouldn't have gotten such a score today. In the face of such a score, don't you feel ashamed? Li Yi casually pointed at them and said loudly, all those who didn't pass the examination today, frog jumped 10 times around the field. The 21 students stood rooted to the ground, their expressions indescribable. Jing Di, who was still nodding, felt his neck stiffen. The smiles on the faces of the officials behind him froze at this moment. You're tuning in to the Journey of the Soul YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.